At 0600 hours local time, the calm over Rostov Oblast shattered without warning. The sound came first, raw and unmistakable, a tearing chorus of small engines that rolled across fields and towns like a challenge. Dozens of Ukrainian drones crossed the border together, flying low, fast, and unapologetically loud. There was no attempt at concealment, no effort to soften their acoustic signature. This was not an accident or a mistake. It was an announcement. Every spinning propeller was meant to be heard, every vibration designed to trigger alarms, scramble crews, and force reactions. Russian observers did exactly what doctrine demanded. Alerts went out, crews moved to weapons. Confidence followed close behind. They believed they understood the shape of the attack before the first drone even appeared on the horizon. Zu-23 gun trucks were the first to answer. Crews swung their barrels skyward as dark shapes cut across the morning light. One gunner locked onto the lead drone at roughly 1,400 meters, his reflex sight framing a clean silhouette against the pale sky. He fired. The first burst stitched empty air. No panic, no hesitation. He corrected instinctively, adjusting his aim by meters rather than millimeters, understanding exactly how distance magnified error. The second burst struck true. A 23mm shell does not need precision to kill something built from thin aluminum and fuel. The impact ripped the drone apart in an instant. Gasoline flashed, metal fragmented. The wreckage rained down in burning shards. Across the line, other crews were already firing, walking tracers into targets with brutal efficiency. Fire, watch, correct, fire again. The sky became a grid of intersecting arcs and falling debris. Within minutes, the engagement looked decisive. Drone after drone disintegrated under concentrated fire. Crews reported confirmed kills, barrels glowing, ammunition belts thinning. The system was doing exactly what it was built to do. Loud targets died quickly. Predictable targets died even faster. Requests went up to pause firing, to reload, to cool weapons pushed hard toward their limits. From the Russian perspective, this was dominance. What they did not see was that every explosion, every tracer line, every muzzle flash was feeding the real operation. The swarm was not there to survive. It was there to be destroyed. Each drone that died marked a firing position. Each burst mapped a sector. Each confident report confirmed assumptions that were about to be exploited. Far from the noise, a different drone moved with none of the drama. It flew at treetop height, slipping along a riverbed where mist and shadow erased edges and distorted depth. Its engine note was subdued, its profile compact, its surface dull and gray. From above, it blended into water and foliage. From the side, it never broke the horizon. Optical systems depend on contrast, on shapes cutting cleanly against open sky. This drone denied them that geometry entirely. Even if a gunner had stared directly into its path, he would have seen nothing worth firing at. Grass moved, water reflected light. Shadows shifted. The drone passed beneath the gun belt while crews reloaded and congratulated themselves on a job well done. Its operator, sitting tens of kilometers away, logged timestamps and headings with cold precision. The loud drones had done their job. Attention was spent. Ammunition was spent. The field was open. As the surviving drones pushed deeper, Russian doctrine escalated exactly as written. Panzer batteries took over, radar beams snapping onto targets that leaked through the outer layer. On screens, the picture was clean and reassuring. Multiple tracks, solid returns, easy solutions. The fire control system assigned priorities and solved lead angles faster than any human ever could. 30mm cannons elevated and fired in controlled bursts. Proximity-fused rounds detonated near their targets, shredding wings, rupturing fuel tanks, tearing drones apart without needing direct hits. In seconds, the airframes vanished from radar, replaced by falling fragments and fading heat signatures. Efficiency numbers would look excellent in the after-action report. Ammunition expenditure was low. Kill ratios were high. By every measurable standard, the defense had worked. What the screens did not show was the empty space beneath the radar horizon. The systems were tuned for threats that behaved like threats were supposed to behave. Fast, high. The small drone stayed low, buried in terrain folds. Its radar signature filtered out as clutter, its path invisible to sensors biased upward by decades of assumptions. To the Panzer fire control logic, it was noise. To the commanders watching their displays, it did not exist. Reports went out declaring the primary threat neutralized. Sectors turned green. The battle, as far as they were concerned, was over. The quiet drone kept flying, untouched, unacknowledged, and perfectly positioned to prove how wrong that belief was. With the radar picture scrubbed clean and reports flowing upward, Russian command shifted into the next doctrinal phase. Man-portable air defense teams were ordered to remain alert for stragglers. the damaged remnants that often limp through after a swarm is broken. Across the oblast, 9 333 Verba crews took positions on rooftops, forest edges, and shallow ridgelines, their launch tubes shoulders and their optics sweeping the open sky. They were hunting heat, silhouette, and motion, trained to recognize the specific signature of small gasoline engines backlit against morning light. And there was plenty to see. Burning debris tumbled downward. Damaged drones staggered through the air trailing smoke. To the Verba teams, the picture made sense. This was exactly what the end of a successful engagement looked like. The first lock came quickly. A smoking drone crossed a clear patch of sky at altitude, its engine glowing hot and its wingspan large enough to register cleanly across multiple sensor bands. The seeker confirmed the match. Infrared, ultraviolet, near-infrared all agreed. The missile launched and struck seconds later, detonating close enough to tear the drone apart mid-air. Another gunner fired at a wobbling target with half a wing missing, its flight path erratic but unmistakably airborne. A third team engaged what they believed was a live drone, only to destroy a chunk of burning wreckage still radiating residual heat. The teams reported multiple successful intercepts. Ammunition expenditure climbed, confidence followed. Above them, the last visible drones were being erased one by one. Below all of this, the small drone moved unseen. It hugged terrain so tightly that its flight path broke line of sight every few seconds. Its engine produced almost no thermal contrast, its composite body hovering near ambient temperature. At any range beyond a few hundred meters, its angular size fell below the Verba Seeker's classification threshold. The system needs persistence to lock, a stable silhouette, continuous motion along a predictable vector. This drone denied all of it. One gunner paused when his thermal scope flickered with movement near ground level. It was faint, brief, and inconsistent. He watched for several seconds. The contact did not repeat. The drone passed directly through his engagement envelope without ever being categorized as a threat. As the last missiles flew and reports stacked up, the air defense picture stabilized. From headquarters, the board showed no remaining hostile tracks. Panzer engagements complete. Verba teams reporting clean skies, gun trucks rearming. By procedure, this triggered the next step. A helicopter would launch to visually confirm wreckage, document impact sites, and ensure no threats remained airborne. At 0623 local time, a Mi-8 crew received clearance. Rotors spun up, blades biting into the air as the aircraft lifted and turned west toward the debris field. To command, this was routine. To the drone operator watching through a narrow gap in the canopy, it was the first glimpse of the real target. The operator did not have a full picture, only fragments. A rotor flashed through branches, a blur of motion, then nothing. He adjusted course by degrees rather than meters, shaping an intercept based on where the helicopter should be, not where he could continuously see it. The drone dropped lower, trimming altitude to stay masked by terrain. Intercept geometry began to form slowly, deliberately. Helicopters fly predictably during post-engagement surveys. Slow, low, methodical. The drone followed at distance, matching heading, closing the gap without rushing. Patience mattered more than speed now. A single mistake would end the mission. Russian command added one more layer, confident it would seal the engagement. Electronic warfare systems powered up, flooding the area with broadband interference designed to sever drone links and collapse navigation. Consumer-grade drones failed almost immediately, spiraling down or gliding helplessly as control vanished. Radio traffic reflected satisfaction. The jamming bubble was working. What the operators did not understand was that this particular drone was not built to fail that way. Its link was narrow, directional, encrypted, hopping frequencies faster than the jammers could track. Its navigation did not depend on satellites. Even as static crept into the video feed and latency increased, the operator adjusted antenna alignment and pressed on. The interference slowed him, but it did not stop him. The helicopter flew on, unaware, and the distance between hunter and target continued to shrink. The helicopter settled into its survey pattern exactly as Doctrine predicted. The operator watched the helicopter grow from a speck into a defined machine, rotor disc shimmering against the sky. Latency still hovered above 200 milliseconds, enough to punish sloppy inputs. He did not chase the image. He anticipated it. The control system helped, smoothing commands and predicting intent based on recent motion. This allowed the drone to fly slightly ahead of what the operator saw, compensating for delay without overshooting. Every adjustment was minimal, almost invisible, because large corrections would betray presence. Timing mattered more than thrust. Arrive too early and the helicopter might spot the drone. Arrive too late and the aircraft would finish its patrol and turn away. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. The drone closed to 800 meters, then 600, then 400. The operator resisted the urge to accelerate. Instead, he matched speed, letting the helicopter do the work of alignment. The aircraft slowed to orbit another debris field, its nose dipping slightly as the pilots prepared a left turn. That turn opened the final window. The drone rose just enough to clear the tree line, still masked from any lateral view, but from this angle, it was invisible to the crew, a small gray shape climbing through air they assumed was empty. The pilots were focused on maintaining altitude and spacing. The blind spot held. At 200 meters, the approach became committed. The drone climbed at a shallow angle, lining itself with the rotor mast rather than the fuselage. This was not guesswork. The target was chosen because it could not be ignored. Damage to the rotor system does not degrade a helicopter gracefully. It ends the flight immediately. The drone's sensors compared frame-to-frame movement, calculating closure against the helicopter's body without relying on any external signal. The operator made a final correction of only a few degrees, placing the drone directly above the center of rotation. There was no warning sound, no visual cue, nothing for the crew to react to. Impact came less than 20 seconds after the drone broke cover. The warhead detonated on contact, driving fragments into the rotor head and pitch control assembly. Mechanical links severed instantly. The blades lost coordinated control within a single rotation. Lift became uneven, violent. One blade flapped beyond its limits and struck another, shattering both near the root. The imbalance tore the remaining blades free in rapid succession. The helicopter dropped without the possibility of recovery. There was no time for auto-rotation, no altitude to trade for control. The fuselage twisted and fell, the flight ending as abruptly as it had begun. On paper, every defensive layer had succeeded. Gun trucks destroyed the swarm. Medium-range systems eliminated leakers. Man-portable teams cleared the sky. Electronic warfare suppressed remaining signals. Reports were accurate within their narrow frames. The failure was not technical. It was conceptual. The loud drones existed to be killed, to consume attention and resources until certainty replaced caution. The quiet drone existed to exploit that certainty. Every shot fired, every radar sweep completed. Every confident transmission sent upward helped shape the conditions for the strike. The defense won the battle it believed it was fighting. The drone won the one that mattered. In the minutes that followed, silence spread faster than any alarm ever could. Radios carried clipped confirmations, fragments of information struggling to assemble into a picture that no one wanted to see clearly. The helicopter was gone. Not damaged, not forced down, not limping home, but erased from the airspace it was supposed to control. On the ground, commanders replayed timelines that no longer aligned. Sky had been declared clear. The threat board had shown green. Every system had reported success. Yet a helicopter had launched into that supposedly sanitized space and never returned. Contradiction was not subtle. It was violent, undeniable, and deeply uncomfortable. Somewhere between the last confident report and the rising column of smoke, the assumptions underpinning the entire defensive architecture had collapsed. The most dangerous part was not the loss itself, but what it revealed. The layered defense had not failed because it malfunctioned. It failed because it worked exactly as intended against the threats it was designed to recognize. Each layer engaged the targets it was trained to see, and each one succeeded. Loud drones died to guns. High drones died to radar-guided fire. Hot drones died to infrared seekers. Weak links died to jamming. The problem was that none of those layers were built to question whether the most dangerous object in the air would announce itself at all. Quiet drone never challenged the systems directly. It flowed around them, beneath them, inside the blind spaces created by doctrine and expectation. As analysts reconstructed the engagement, a pattern emerged that could not be ignored. Every defensive action reinforced Ukrainian intent. Gun trucks revealed positions. Missile launches cluttered sensors. Debris generated false targets. Jamming confirmed frequencies and reaction thresholds. Even the helicopter launch followed a predictable script, timed and routed according to procedure. The drone operator did not need to outthink every system. He only needed to understand the order in which those systems would be used and the assumptions each one made about what mattered. The swarm shaped perception. The quiet drone exploited it. By the time anyone realized there was a different problem unfolding, the geometry of the intercept was already locked. This is the shift that modern battlefields are struggling to absorb. Control no longer belongs exclusively to the side with more sensors, more missiles, or more layers. It belongs to the side that understands how those layers interact. The small drone did not overpower defenses. It outlasted them. It waited until certainty replaced suspicion, until confidence replaced caution. The moment the defenders believed the fight was over was the moment the real attack began. That timing was not dramatic by accident. it was engineered. For Russian air defense, the implications cut deeper than the loss of a single aircraft. The engagement demonstrated that success against 99% of visible threats can still mask total failure against the one that matters. The systems did not miss the drone because it was advanced beyond comprehension. They missed it because it refused to behave like a target. It never asked to be tracked. It never demanded engagement. It never entered the boxes that sensors were watching. In doing so, it forced a brutal reassessment of what dominance in the air actually means when the sky is crowded with machines designed to manipulate attention rather than conchette it. When the dust settled and reports were finalized, the numbers still looked good on paper. Drones destroyed, missiles expended efficiently, guns effective, jammers functional. And yet the outcome told a different story, one that could not be smoothed over by statistics. The swarm had not been an attack. It had been a question. The defenses answered it exactly as expected. The quiet drone delivered the response. The layered system had proven lethal, disciplined, and precise. And in doing so, it had also proven predictable. In modern warfare, predictability is not a strength, it is an opening. What made the strike resonate far beyond the wreckage was how little brute force it required. No overwhelming firepower, no technological miracle, no breach of physics. The operation succeeded because it exploited human certainty as aggressively as it exploited terrain. Every defender involved behaved rationally, professionally, and according to training. That was the weakness. The defenses were not tricked by deception in the traditional sense. They were guided, step by step, into reinforcing the wrong conclusion. Each confirmation of success narrowed their perception further until the idea of an unseen threat became implausible. By the time reality contradicted the picture, the timeline could not be reversed. The moment demanded doubt, but doctrine had already replaced doubt with procedure. The psychological dimension mattered as much as the mechanical one. Loud drones condition operators to expect noise, movement, and saturation. Silence, by contrast, feels like absence rather than intent. This asymmetry reshapes decision-making under pressure. When nothing appears on sensors, commanders interpret that as safety, not as uncertainty. The quiet drone exploited this bias mercilessly. It did not rush, it did not probe. It waited for the defenders to relax their mental posture, to shift from hunting to confirming. In that space between vigilance and routine, the strike became inevitable. The helicopter launch was not a mistake. It was a signal that the defenders believed the fight was finished. From a strategic perspective, the engagement underscored how layered defense can become layered distraction. Each tier narrows focus, assigns responsibility, and hands off the problem to the next system. This creates seams, not gaps in hardware, but gaps in accountability and perception. When one layer reports success, the next assumes a reduced threat environment. Over time, that assumption hardens into expectation. The small drone moved through those seams effortlessly because it was never the primary concern of any single layer. It was too low, too quiet, too insignificant to matter until it mattered absolutely. In complex systems, what no one owns often becomes what no one sees. The aftermath also exposed a deeper asymmetry in cost and consequence. The swarm drones were expendable by design, sacrificed openly to shape the battle space. The helicopter was not. Its loss carried operational material and symbolic weight far beyond the value of the drone that destroyed it. This imbalance is not accidental. It is the economic core of modern drone warfare. Cheap systems exist to consume attention, resources, and confidence, while the decisive blow comes from something that costs less, but strikes where recovery is impossible. The exchange ratio is brutal, and it favors the side willing to think in terms of inevitability rather than survivability. What lingers from the engagement is not a question of whether defenses should be improved, but whether they can ever fully adapt to threats that refuse to validate their own existence. Sensors can be refined, algorithms adjusted, doctrines rewritten. But as long as systems are built around expectations of how threats should behave, there will be actors willing to behave differently. The quiet drone did not defeat air defense by being stronger. It defeated it by being patient, by allowing the defenders to win every visible fight, and by striking only after victory had already been declared. That is the kind of lesson that does not fade quickly because it is not about machines. It is about how certainty is manufactured and how easily it can be weaponized. At 0342 hours on August 4, 2023, a Russian naval officer standing watch aboard the Elenigorsky Gornyak was likely pouring his third coffee of the night, completely unaware that a robotic predator had been stalking his vessel for the last 4 hours. In exactly 7 minutes, 3,600 tons of Soviet-era steel would become the centerpiece of a naval disaster that would rewrite the textbooks on maritime security. The massive Rapucha-class landing ship was docked in Novorossiysk, a port city that Russian high command considered an impenetrable fortress, sitting nearly 450 miles from the nearest Ukrainian-held coastline. The crew believed the sheer distance provided a safety buffer that no conventional navy could breach without being detected by radar arrays and satellite surveillance. But what they failed to calculate was that the threat lurking just above the waterline wasn't a conventional warship or a submarine. It was a Sea Baby, an experimental, unmanned surface vessel that had just completed a marathon journey across the entire length of the Black Sea. This wasn't merely a remote-controlled boat. It was a semi-submersible assassin carrying a warhead heavy enough to crack a destroyer in half, and it had arrived at the party uninvited. The specific drone hunting the Russian ship that morning was the culmination of months of clandestine development by the Security Service of Ukraine, a project born from the necessity of fighting a naval war without a navy. While Western powers spend billions on frigates and destroyers, Ukrainian engineers had built a low-profile stealth platform for the cost of a high-end luxury sedan. The Sea Baby is a marvel of efficiency and lethal pragmatism, designed to carry nearly 1,000 pounds of high-explosive payload, specifically 450 kilograms of trinitrotoluene, directly into the hull of an enemy ship. To put that in perspective, a standard anti-ship missile might carry a warhead a fraction of that weight. This drone was essentially a guided bomb the size of a canoe, equipped with a Starlink terminal for real-time control and electro-optical sensors that allowed the operator, sitting safely in a bunker hundreds of miles away, to see the target with terrifying clarity. The operator's screen displayed a grainy, monochromatic feed of the Novorossiysk harbor lights reflecting off the water, a stark contrast to the pitch-black open ocean the drone had navigated for hours. The journey itself was a technical miracle, requiring the drone to traverse hundreds of miles of hostile waters, dodging Russian patrol boats, surveillance aircraft, and electronic warfare, jamming attempts that would have blinded a lesser machine. Navigating a small drone across 450 miles of open ocean is not like flying a quadcopter in your backyard. It is an exercise in managing physics, fuel, and data latency while fighting the chaotic nature of the sea itself. The Sea Baby operates on the surface, meaning it is constantly buffeted by waves that can obscure the camera feed and disrupt the delicate satellite link required for control. The operator in Kyiv had to manually adjust the throttle and steering constantly to keep the drone on course, fighting the drag of the water and the unpredictable currents of the Black Sea. Every time the drone dipped into a trough between waves, the signal strength would fluctuate, threatening to sever the connection and leave the drone drifting aimlessly as an expensive piece of flotsam. The engineering team had accounted for this by designing a hull that was low enough to minimize radar cross-section, but buoyant enough to handle sea states that would capsize a normal pleasure craft. Result was a ghost on the water, a vessel that appeared on Russian radar screens as nothing more than a patch of sea clutter or a large bird, if it appeared at all. The Russian radar operators, likely staring at screens filled with the noise of commercial shipping traffic, had no reason to suspect that one specific blip was carrying enough explosives to level a city block. By 0343 hours, the Sea Baby had closed the distance to less than 2 miles from the harbor entrance. The target, the Elenigorsky Gornyak, loomed large in the thermal cameras, its massive steel hull radiating heat absorbed during the day against the cool night air. This vessel was one of the workhorses of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, designed during the height of the Cold War to deposit main battle tanks and naval infantry onto contested beaches. At 360 feet long, it was a massive target, and on this night, it was sitting low in the water, heavy with equipment and supplies intended for the front lines. The ship's crew had seemingly fallen victim to the most dangerous enemy in warfare: complacency. Because Novorossiysk was considered a rearguard logistical hub, far removed from the missile duels of the Western Black Sea, the ship's defensive posture was practically non-existent. There were no searchlights sweeping the water, no heavy machine guns manned at the rails, and no close-in weapon systems tracking the incoming threat. The operator in the bunker could see the silhouette of the ship clearly now, the distinctive ramp of the landing craft standing out against the backdrop of the port's industrial cranes. The approach into the harbor was the most critical phase of the operation, a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek played with live explosives. The drone operator had to navigate the Sea Baby through a maze of civilian traffic, fishing boats, and moored vessels, all while keeping a low profile to avoid visual detection. The Starlink terminal on the drone's back was beaming high-definition video back to headquarters, but the latency meant that every command had a split-second delay. If a patrol boat suddenly crossed the drone's path, the operator would have less than a second to react. The tension in the command center was palpable as the drone slipped past the outer breakwater. The operator throttled down to reduce the wake, creeping forward at a slow, deliberate pace. The goal was to blend in with the natural movement of the water, to become just another wave in a harbor full of them. On the screen, the lights of the Russian naval base grew brighter, casting long reflections on the black water. The operator could see crew members walking on the decks of nearby ships, smoking cigarettes and chatting, completely oblivious to the fact that a remote-controlled shark was swimming in their pool. As the Sea Baby maneuvered closer, the operator began the final target selection process, scanning the docked ships to confirm the identity of the primary target. Intelligence reports had indicated that the Olenegorski Gornyak was loaded with sensitive cargo, making it a priority target over the other vessels in the port. The operator toggled between thermal and optical modes, looking for the specific structural features that identified the Rapacha-class landing ship. The thermal imaging revealed the heat signature of the ship's engines, which were still warm, indicating that the vessel had recently arrived or was preparing for departure. This was the moment where the mission would either succeed brilliantly or fail miserably. If the drone was spotted now, the Russians could open fire with everything from small arms to rapid-fire cannons, shredding the fiberglass hull in seconds. The operator's hands moved with practiced precision, making micro-adjustments to the course to keep the drone in the blind spots of the ship's limited watch standing. The distance to the target ticked down on the display: 800 meters, 700 meters, 600 meters. The drone was now so close that the operator could see the rust streaks on the hull and the individual cables running along the deck. At 0344 hours, the operator made the decision to commit to the attack run. The drone was now positioned perfectly off the port beam of the Olenegorski Gornyak. The geometry of the strike was calculated to maximize damage. Hitting the ship amidships would bypass the reinforced bow and strike the vulnerable engine compartments and cargo holds. The operator nudged the throttle forward, pushing the Sea Baby from a stealthy creep to its terminal attack speed. The engine roared to life, churning the water into a white froth as the drone accelerated. But this wasn't a straight shot. The harbor currents were pushing the drone slightly to the right, and the operator had to fight the drift to keep the crosshairs centered on the ship's waterline. The video feed began to shake violently as the speed increased, the image blurring with the vibration of the engine and the impact of the waves. The Russian ship grew larger in the frame, a wall of gray steel that filled the operator's entire field of view. On the deck of the Olenegorski Gornyak, a sailor might have heard the sudden buzz of the engine or seen the white wake streaking toward them out of the darkness. But the laws of physics and reaction time were already conspiring against them. The operator locked his eyes on the center of the ship's hull, his finger hovering over the final arming sequence, ready to deliver a wake-up call that would be heard all the way in Moscow. At 0345 hours, the laws of hydrodynamics and high explosives converged in a single violent millisecond. As the Sea Baby closed the final 50 meters, the operator in Kyiv made one last micro-correction to the steering, aiming for the section of the hull directly below the ship's superstructure. This was the sweet spot. The Russian crew, likely alerted by the sudden roar of the drone's engine or the phosphorescent wake striping the dark water, had virtually zero time to react. There was no time to sound the general alarm, no time to man the damage control stations, and certainly no time to traverse the deck guns. The drone, traveling at nearly 50 miles per hour, slammed into the port side of the Olenegorski Gornyak. On the operator's screen, the feed froze for a split second, a final, grainy image of the gray steel hull filling the frame before cutting to static. The connection was severed not by signal loss, but by the immediate vaporization of the drone itself. But while the screen in Kyiv went dark, the harbor in Novorossiysk lit up with the ferocity of a lightning strike. The 450-kilogram warhead did not just explode. It transferred its energy into the incompressible water surrounding the hull, creating a massive gas bubble that expanded and collapsed with pile-driving force. The physics of an underwater detonation are far more destructive than an airburst. When that much trinitrotoluene detonates against a submerged surface, it creates a shockwave moving at nearly 1,500 meters per second. The steel plating of the Rapacha-class landing ship, designed in the 1970s to withstand small arms fire and beaching operations, was never built to handle a localized pressure wave of this magnitude. Immediately, the Black Sea began to reclaim the vessel. Water rushed into the engineering spaces at a rate of tons per second, a high-pressure geyser that stripped piping from the bulkheads and shorted out electrical panels instantly. The ship's internal watertight doors, often left open by lazy crews in safe harbors, failed to contain the flooding. The blast wave traveled through the ship's internal structure, knocking sailors from their bunks and throwing equipment across compartments. The Olenegorski Gornyak, a vessel that had survived decades of service, was effectively gutted in less time than it takes to blink. As the sun rose over Novorossiysk, the full extent of the disaster became undeniable, despite the Russian Ministry of Defense initially claiming that all attacking drones had been successfully repelled. The visual evidence circulating on social media told a very different story. The 360-foot landing ship was listing heavily to port, tilting at a grotesque 40-degree angle that suggested the water inside was fighting to capsize it completely. Tugboats swarmed the stricken vessel like ants on a dying beetle, desperately pushing and pulling the massive hull toward the pier to prevent it from sinking in the harbor channel. This was the toe of shame, a public spectacle that broadcasted Russian naval incompetence to the entire world in high definition. The ship was listing so severely that its port side gunnels were awash, and the satellite imagery confirmed that it was being dragged to a dry dock, likely out of action for the duration of the war. The damage control parties had clearly lost the battle against the flooding, and only the shallow depth of the harbor likely prevented the ship from turning into a permanent artificial reef. The strategic return on investment for this operation is staggering when you break down the numbers. The Seababy drone costs approximately $250,000 to manufacture. The Olenegorski Gornyak, even with its age, represents a replacement value of roughly $200 million, not including the specialized military cargo it was carrying. That is a cost-exchange ratio of 1 to 800. But the financial damage goes far beyond the hull of one ship. By striking Novorossiysk, Ukraine effectively spiked the insurance premiums for every commercial vessel entering Russian Black Sea ports. The war risk surcharges for tankers and grain ships skyrocketed, bleeding millions of dollars from the Russian economy every single week. Furthermore, the psychological impact forced the Russian Navy to disperse its fleet even further east, running to ports like Feodosia and eventually occupied Abkhazia, stretching their logistics lines to the breaking point. They were forced to expend thousands of man-hours and millions of dollars building floating booms and anti-drone nets, resources that could have been used on the front lines. This strike proved that the age of the large, untouchable surface combatants is coming to a close, at least in the confines of the Black Sea. A navy with virtually no warships had managed to cripple a major amphibious asset of a global superpower using garage-built technology and a Starlink connection. The Olenegorski Gornyak was supposed to be a symbol of Russian projection of power, a vessel capable of landing tanks on enemy shores. Instead, it became a symbol of vulnerability, a listing hulk propped up by tugboats, defeated by a jet ski on steroids. The message to the Kremlin was crystal clear. There are no safe harbors left. Whether docked in Sevastopol or hiding 450 miles away in Novorossiysk, if it floats, it can sink. And as the Russian engineers stared at the gaping hole in the side of their ship, wondering how to patch a wound that big, the Ukrainian operators were likely already preparing the next Seababy for another long, dark swim. But the Ukrainian operators were not done yet, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet was about to learn that lightning can indeed strike the same place twice, or at least the same coastline within 24 hours. At 23:20 hours on August 4, 2023, just as the sun had set on the humiliated Olenegorski Gornyak in Novorossiysk, a second Seababy drone was already cutting through the chop 30 miles south of the Kerch Strait. The target this time was the SIG, a 140-meter chemical tanker that had been sanctioned by the United States for transporting jet fuel to Russian forces in Syria. While technically a civilian vessel, intelligence reports confirmed it was acting as a floating gas station for the military effort, carrying 5,000 tons of specialized fuel. The Russians were on maximum alert. Patrol boats were sweeping the water, and searchlights from the Kerch Bridge were slicing through the darkness like prison watchtowers. Yet despite the paranoia and the heightened defensive posture, the drone slipped through the perimeter. It navigated the chaotic currents where the Black Sea meets the Sea of Azov, a notorious choke point that is heavily monitored by radar and sonar systems. The fact that a semi-submersible drone could penetrate this zone less than a day after a major attack suggests that Russian detection capabilities were not just flawed, but fundamentally broken against this low-profile threat. The approach to the SIG was a masterclass in exploiting the noise of maritime traffic. The tanker was drifting slowly near the anchorage area, its engines idling, likely waiting for a slot to pass under the bridge or transfer cargo. To the drone operator, the ship appeared as a massive thermal bloom on the screen, the heat from its machinery radiating against the cool sea surface. This was a high-risk engagement. Hitting a chemical tanker carries significant environmental risks, But the operator's orders were precise: target the engine room, not the cargo tanks. The goal was a mobility kill, not an ecological disaster. The Sea Baby, loaded with another 450-kilogram warhead, closed the distance at a steady 30 knots. The operator had to be surgical. The SIG's hull is reinforced for carrying volatile liquids, meaning a glancing blow might only dent the outer plating. To achieve a mission kill, the drone had to strike the aft section below the waterline, directly where the propeller shaft and main engines were housed. This is the Achilles heel of any large vessel. Flood the engine room, and the ship becomes a 4,000-ton paperweight, completely dependent on tugs for movement and generators for power. At roughly 0002 hours on August 5th, the Sea Baby initiated its terminal dive. The Russian crew aboard the SIG reportedly heard a loud buzzing sound seconds before impact, a terrifying audio signature that has become the hallmark of modern naval warfare. But hearing the drone and stopping it are two very different things. The drone slammed into the starboard side of the tanker, directly amidships near the waterline of the engine compartment. The explosion was massive, reportedly audible to residents on the nearby Crimean coast. The 450 kilograms of trinitrotoluene detonated with enough force to buckle the thick steel plating and blow out the internal bulkheads protecting the machinery space. In an instant, the engine room was transformed into a chaotic mix of seawater, oil, and twisted metal. Audio recordings intercepted from the bridge captured the panic of the crew as they realized the pumps were useless against the influx of water. The ship didn't sink, but it listed sharply, its engine room completely flooded and its propulsion systems destroyed. The safe anchorage south of the bridge had turned into a kill zone. At 0314 hours on March 12, 2025, a shift supervisor at the Ryazan oil refinery was pouring his third cup of coffee, completely unaware that a swarm of 35 Ukrainian long-range drones had been tracking toward his facility for the past 4 hours. In exactly 120 seconds, the fractional distillation column outside his window, a critical piece of infrastructure responsible for processing 60,000 barrels of crude oil daily, would cease to be a profitable industrial asset and instead become the world's most expensive candle. The attack force had launched from the Chernihiv region at 2300 hours, navigating through the pitch-black night using a complex series of waypoints designed to exploit the known gaps in Russian radar coverage. This was not a random harassment fire mission. This was a synchronized, multi-vector strike package aimed at the jugular of Moscow's energy economy. The primary weapon of choice for this operation was the Lyuty, a Ukrainian-manufactured strategic drone that looks less like a weapon of war and more like a twin-boom civilian hobby plane, until you realize it carries a 75-kilogram warhead over a range of 1,000 kilometers. Its push-propeller configuration, driven by a reliable 50-horsepower internal combustion engine, pushed the composite airframe through the freezing Russian spring air at a leisurely 150 kilometers per hour. Why fly supersonic when you can fly low, slow, and virtually invisible against the ground clutter? The route planning for this raid was a masterclass in geospatial analysis and patience, instead of flying a straight line toward Moscow, which would have taken them directly into the teeth of the formidable ring of S-400 and Panzer air defense batteries protecting the capital. The drone operators chose a path that looked insane on a map. They skirted the border of Belarus, dipped low over the winding river valleys of the Smolensk region, and used the dense forests as a natural radar shield. At an altitude of less than 50 meters, the drones were effectively hiding in the electronic shadow of the terrain. The Russian radar operators, sitting in their warm command trucks, scanning for high-altitude bombers or ballistic missiles, had almost zero chance of spotting a carbon fiber object with the radar cross-section of a large pigeon skimming the treetops. The drone's onboard navigation system was equally sophisticated. It did not rely solely on satellite positioning, which the Russians were known to jam heavily around major cities. Instead, it utilized a form of terrain contour matching, comparing the physical landscape below with a stored digital map, ensuring that even if the GPS signal turned into garbage, the drone still knew exactly where it was within 3 meters. By 0320, the lead elements of the drone swarm had reached the terminal phase of their flight. a point of no return where stealth is traded for terminal accuracy. The target was the atmospheric distillation unit, specifically the primary column where crude oil is heated to 350 degrees Celsius to separate it into various fuel products. To an engineer, this is the heart of the refinery. Destroy the column, and the entire plant shuts down for 6 to 18 months while a custom-built replacement is manufactured. The economics of this strike are brutal enough to make an accountant weep. The Liuchi drone costs roughly $50,000 to produce. The distillation column it was targeting represents an investment of roughly $150 million, not counting the $500 million in lost revenue from the ensuing downtime. That is a return on investment of 300,000%, achieved in the blink of an eye. As the first drone began its shallow dive toward the lit-up industrial complex, the refinery's local defense systems finally woke up. A localized GPS spoofer kicked in, broadcasting a signal telling the drone it was actually flying over an airport 20 kilometers away. This is where the engineering arms race truly gets interesting. In the early days of the war, that GPS spoofing would have sent the drone veering harmlessly into a field, but the Ukrainian engineers had upgraded the guidance logic with what is known as terminal optical correlation. As the GPS signal drifted into nonsense, the drone's nose camera activated, snapping 30 frames per second of the approaching skyline. The onboard computer compared these high-contrast images of the refinery's distinctive thermal and visual signature against a preloaded target library. It saw the tall, thin, vertical structure of the distillation tower, recognized it as the priority target, and locked in the flight path using pure geometry. It stopped listening to the satellites and started flying with its eyes. At 0322, the shift supervisor inside the control room noticed a sudden anomaly on the perimeter security feeds, a fast-moving shadow that did not belong there. He reached for the emergency shutdown button, a desperate attempt to cut the flow of flammable hydrocarbons. But physics is rarely that forgiving. The first drone slammed into the midpoint of the distillation column at a velocity of 180 kilometers per hour. The impact fused the kinetic energy of the drone with the chemical potential of the target in a catastrophic release of energy. The 75-kilogram warhead, likely a thermobaric or high-explosive fragmentation mix, detonated instantly upon contact with the steel skin of the tower. But the real damage came a split second later. The explosion ruptured the pressurized vessel, releasing superheated crude oil vapor into the oxygen-rich atmosphere. When that vapor cloud met the ignition source of the burning warhead, it created a massive secondary fuel-air explosion that was visible from 20 kilometers away. The shockwave shattered windows in the administration building 400 meters away, but the thermal effects were far worse. The structural steel supports of the tower, suddenly subjected to temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius, began to lose their tensile strength. Within minutes, the massive steel column began to list to the side, threatening to collapse onto the adjacent piping racks and turn a single disaster into a chain reaction of industrial destruction. And this was just the first hit. There were still 34 drones in the air, and they were not all aiming for the same pipe. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Moscow, near the Ramenskoye district, a Russian Pantsir-1 air defense crew was frantically trying to track multiple low-slow targets appearing on their scope. The Pantsir is a formidable system, combining rapid-fire 30mm cannons with 12 supersonic surface-to-air missiles. On paper, it is designed exactly for this scenario. But in practice, the system was being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the attack. The radar computer was trying to process 12 different tracks simultaneously, all moving at different vectors. The operator had to make split-second decisions on which target to prioritize. Do you shoot the one heading for the electrical substation or the one heading for the aviation plant? He locked onto a drone approaching from the southwest and fired a missile. The missile, accelerating to Mach 3 in seconds, intercepted the drone 3 kilometers out, turning it into a cloud of fiberglass confetti. A cheer went up in the cabin, but their celebration was premature. They had expended a missile costing $200,000 to destroy a drone worth $50,000. And while they were reloading, 3 more drones slipped through the engagement envelope, flying below the radar horizon of the system. The second wave of drones was targeting something even more sensitive than oil: the microelectronics and optics factories that supply the Russian military-industrial complex. One specific target was a facility in the Tomilino district known for producing specialized optical coatings for tank sights and missile seekers. This was a precision strike in the truest sense. Unlike the refinery, where a big explosion anywhere is effective, this target required the drone to hit a specific ventilation shaft or roof section to penetrate the clean rooms below. The drone assigned to this target was carrying a shaped charge warhead, similar to an anti-tank weapon but scaled up for structural demolition. As it approached the urban sprawl of Moscow, the electromagnetic environment became a chaotic soup of jamming signals. The Russians were blasting noise across the 2.4 GHz and 5.8 GHz bands, trying to sever any command link. But these drones were fully autonomous, operating on a fire-and-forget principle that required no human hand on the joystick. They were robots on a suicide mission, driven by algorithms that could not be intimidated or confused by radio static. Back at the Ryazan refinery, the situation had escalated from a fire to a full-blown crisis. The collapse of the primary distillation column had ruptured the feed lines for the secondary cracking unit. Burning crude oil was now flowing through the drainage channels, effectively spreading the fire across the facility faster than the emergency crews could deploy foam. The shift supervisor, now evacuated to a safe distance, watched as a second drone circled overhead. This one behaved differently. It did not dive immediately. It loitered, its engine droning with a terrifying patience. This was a tactical evolution that terrified the emergency responders, the double-tap strike. The drone was waiting for the fire crews to gather, or perhaps waiting for a specific thermal signature to present itself as the fire stripped away the insulation on other tanks. It was a psychological weapon as much as a kinetic one, forcing the firefighters to retreat and let the facility burn rather than risk being caught in the next blast. The economic damage meter was spinning like a slot machine, adding millions of dollars to the bill with every passing minute of unchecked combustion. At 0345, the chaos spread to the civilian sector as the Russian authorities initiated Plan Carpet over Moscow's airspace, a protocol that instantly grounds all commercial flights and clears the sky of anything that is not military. At Domodedovo International Airport, 30 kilometers south of the city center, air traffic controllers watched their radar screens fill with false positives and legitimate threats, unable to distinguish between a passenger jet and a loitering munition. This is the hidden cost of drone warfare that rarely makes the headlines. You do not actually have to hit the airport to shut it down. You just have to fly a $20,000 drone within 10 kilometers of the approach path. The economic ripple effect is immediate and brutal. Diverting 20 heavy wide-body aircraft to alternate airfields burns hundreds of tons of jet fuel, disrupts logistics chains for days, and panics the insurance markets. While the Panzer batteries were busy trying to shoot down the physical drones, the mere presence of the swarm was inflicting millions of dollars in operational losses on the Russian aviation sector every hour. It is a form of economic siege warfare where the attacker spends pennies to force the defender to burn stacks of cash just to maintain a semblance of safety. Meanwhile, a different breed of predator was approaching the Lukoil Nizhneudnefteyorg-Zhintez refinery, roughly 400 kilometers east of Moscow. This facility processes 17 million tons of oil annually, turning crude into the high-octane gasoline that fuels the Russian war machine. The weapon approaching this target was not the sleek Lyuchi, but a modified aero-pract A-22 Foxbat, a light sport aircraft converted into an uncrewed aerial vehicle. This monstrosity is the brute force solution to the problem of hardened targets. While the smaller drones carry warheads that can puncture a tank, the converted A-22 carries a payload of nearly 150 kilograms of high explosives. It is essentially a flying car bomb with wings. Flying at 90 kilometers per hour, its Rotax 912 engine screaming like a lawnmower, it relies on sheer audacity rather than stealth. The Russian air defense network is calibrated to detect fast jets or small missiles. A slow-moving, high-radar cross-section plastic plane flying at treetop level creates a cognitive dissonance in the automated targeting logic. Is it a threat? Is it a lost private pilot? By the time the operator decides to fire, the physics of the situation have already decided the outcome. At 0410, the A-22 drone slammed into the refinery's primary fluid catalytic cracking unit. Unlike the earlier strikes which targeted distillation columns, hitting the cracking unit is a stroke of strategic genius. This unit breaks down heavy hydrocarbon molecules into lighter fuels like gasoline and diesel. It operates at extremely high pressures and temperatures, often exceeding 700 degrees Celsius. When the 150-kilogram warhead detonated, it did not just break a pipe. It compromised the structural integrity of a reactor vessel containing hundreds of tons of catalyst and superheated hydrocarbons. The resulting explosion was registered as a magnitude 2.3 seismic event by local monitoring stations. The fireball rose 200 meters into the night sky, a terrifying testament to the energy density of fossil fuels when released uncontrollably. The destruction of this single unit effectively removed 5% of Russia's total gasoline production capacity in a single second. The replacement time for a custom-built catalytic cracker is not measured in weeks, but in years, especially under the crushing weight of international sanctions that block the import of critical Western petrochemical technology. As dawn broke over the Moscow region at 0530, the full scale of the raid became visible to the satellite constellations passing overhead. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have intercepted 58 drones, a statistic that might comfort the general public but terrifies military planners. In a saturation attack, the interception rate is irrelevant. Only the leakage rate matters. If you launch 60 drones and 55 are shot down, but 5 hit critical infrastructure, the mission is a catastrophic success for the attacker. The 5 drones that slipped through the net destroyed assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars and degraded the national energy grid. The Russian air defense crews had expended nearly 120 surface-to-air missiles during the engagement. Each missile costs roughly $200,000 to replace. The total cost of the Ukrainian drone swarm was perhaps $3 million. The cost of the Russian defensive response alone, ignoring the damage to the refineries, was upwards of $24 million. It is an asymmetry that no national budget can sustain indefinitely. You cannot shoot down cheap flying mopeds with gold-plated interceptors forever. The aftermath of the March 12th raid revealed a grim new reality for the Kremlin. The strikes had not just targeted random fuel tanks. They had surgically removed the most complex, hard-to-replace nodes of the energy infrastructure. The attacks targeted the bottlenecks of the process, the distillation towers and cracking units, rather than the storage tanks. A storage tank is just a steel bucket. You can patch it in a week. A distillation tower is a precision-engineered instrument that requires months of fabrication. By knocking out these nodes, Ukraine effectively turned the crude oil in the ground from a strategic asset into a stranded liability. Russia has plenty of oil, but without these refineries, it cannot turn that oil into the diesel required to move tanks or the jet fuel required to fly bombers. The swarm had proven that the concept of a safe rear area was now a historical fiction. With a range of 1,000 kilometers, the Ukrainian drone program had placed the industrial heart of the enemy on the front line. The final insult to the Russian defense network came not from the explosions, but from the silence that followed. As the fires burned at Ryazan, Kstovo, and Kurishi, the global energy markets reacted with predictable volatility. Gasoline futures spiked by 4.5% in trading, reflecting the uncertainty of supply. But for the engineers assessing the wreckage, the message was clear. The era of immune airspace was over. The combination of commercial electronics, clever coding, and basic aerodynamics had defeated one of the world's most dense air defense environments. The drones had utilized a mix of inertial guidance, terrain following, and terminal optical homing to bypass layers of electronic warfare and kinetic interceptors. They had turned the physics of radar horizons and the economics of missile defense against their creators. As the smoke cleared over the blackened skeletons of the distillation columns, one thing was certain: the swarm would be back, and next time, there would be even more of them. At 4:17 a.m. local time on January 5, 2026, a Russian colonel stationed at the Krychev 6 airbase in eastern Belarus was likely pouring his third cup of coffee, completely unaware that his career and his physical existence was about to end in exactly 94 seconds. He was sitting in the command bunker of what Moscow claimed was the most secure military facility on the planet, guarding a weapon system that President Putin had bragged was untouchable by Western defenses. But outside, in the freezing pre-dawn darkness, physics was about to negotiate a very different outcome. What the colonel did not know was that a $1.2 billion stockpile of Oreshnik hypersonic missiles had been tracked for the last 72 hours by Ukrainian intelligence, and the airspace above him was already teeming with threats his radar screens failed to identify correctly until it was far too late. In less than 2 minutes, a facility designed to threaten every capital in Europe would be transformed into a 4,000-foot tower of flame visible from a low Earth orbit. Secondary explosions would become so violent that they would trip seismic sensors 300 miles away in Poland, registering as a localized earthquake. Ukraine was not just attempting to intercept a missile, they were executing a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, using 2 aircraft and 10 plastic drones to dismantle a strategic nuclear deterrent before it could even open its launch bay doors. This was not a lucky shot. It was a calculated, physics-based dismantling of Russian hubris. And to understand the sheer scale of this catastrophe, you have to look at the months of silent planning that turned a routine winter night into the most expensive fireworks display in military history. To understand why this specific target was so high value, we have to rewind to late December of 2025. While the rest of the world was distracted by holiday headlines, satellite intelligence analysts were tracking a chilling series of heavy transport movements while heading toward Krychev 6, a Soviet-era relic sitting just 250 miles north of the Ukrainian border. This was not just a routine rotation of troops. This was the Kremlin's ultimate strategic flex. Russia was positioning the first fully operational battery of the Oreshnik system on foreign soil, placing a knife directly against the throat of NATO. For those who have not parsed the technical manuals, the Oreshnik is not just another rocket. It is a solid fuel monster capable of re-entry speeds exceeding Mach 10, or roughly 7,600 miles per hour. It carries multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, meaning a single missile can drop 6 separate nuclear or conventional warheads on 6 different cities simultaneously with virtually no warning. Moscow had spent billions of dollars and thousands of man-hours developing this system specifically to bypass Western air defenses. By parking 10 of these mobile launchers in Belarus, they believed they had created a checkmate scenario. However, the Ukrainian high command saw something different. They saw a target-rich environment. They knew that solid fuel missiles are notoriously volatile and that for a brief window, all 10 launchers would be parked together, fully fueled, and sitting side by side like a row of dominoes waiting to be tipped over. The plan they devised was simple, but incredibly gutsy. Do not strike when they are moving, and do not strike when they are empty. Wait until the Russians have loaded every single dollar of their investment into one vulnerable bunker, and then light a match. The Russians were not stupid. They knew Krychev 6 was a prime target, and they had transformed the airbase into a high-tech fortress designed to repel exactly this kind of attack. To protect these billion-dollar assets, Russia deployed a triple-threat defensive umbrella that looked impenetrable on paper. First, they stationed 3 full battalions of the S-400 Triumph system, utilizing the dreaded Gravestone radar designed to track hundreds of targets simultaneously at ranges of up to 240 miles. Layered underneath this long-range shield were the Pantsir-Ishki Shiwan-Mai and Torum-2 systems, creating a dense mesh of autocannons and short-range interceptors designed to shred anything that slipped through the outer net. To any traditional military planner from the 1990s, attacking this site would be considered a suicide mission. The radar density alone would suggest that nothing larger than a sparrow could approach the perimeter without being vaporized. But Ukrainian strategists knew that Russian doctrine relied heavily on the belief that their radar saw everything. The flaw in the Russian thinking was the assumption that the enemy would fight a conventional air war. Ukraine had no intention of flying directly into the teeth of the S-400. Instead, they prepared a specialized strike package, consisting of just 2 F-16 Block 7072 Vipers, the most advanced variants in the sky, and 10 specialized long-range one-way drones. The strategy was to use the Russians' own technology against them, turning their sophisticated radars into a liability rather than an asset. The chess match was set, 2 jets against an entire nuclear-capable battery, and the Russians were about to learn that having the most expensive radar in the world does not matter if you do not know what you are looking at. The operation began in complete silence at 11 p.m. on January 4th, at a secluded tarmac near Chernihiv. The silence of the Ukrainian night was broken only by the low, rhythmic hum of 6 gasoline engines coming to life. These were the Lyuty long-range drones, Ukraine's premier deep strike assets. These machines are essentially $15,000 digital ghosts with a 600-mile reach, powered by simple engines that sound more like lawnmowers than military hardware. As they lifted off, they did not climb to altitude where they could be easily spotted. Instead, the onboard flight computers executed a nap of the Earth flight profile, leveling off at a terrifyingly low altitude of just 140 feet. At this height, the drones are physically hiding behind the curvature of the planet and the dense Belarusian tree lines, flying well underneath the 370-mile search radius of the Russian Big Bird acquisition radar. For the next 3 hours, these 6 drones navigated via high-precision inertial sensors and anti-jamming GPS, correcting their course every millisecond with mathematical perfection to stay inside the radar shadows. But 6 drones, no matter how stealthy, were not enough to crack the defenses of Khrushchev 6 alone. They needed a distraction. They needed to force the Russians to look up while the real threat crawled in through the mud. This was the job of the first F-16, call sign Wild Weasel. This pilot was not there to shoot down planes. He was there to create a phantom army that would panic the Russian operators into making a fatal mistake. At exactly 3:45 a.m., as the drones were silently approaching the perimeter, the Wild Weasel executed the first phase of the trap. Loitering safely inside Ukrainian airspace, the F-16 pilot released 2 ADM-160 MAL DJ decoys. These are not missiles. They are programmable actors. Each decoy is a small flight vehicle that can replicate the exact radar signature and electromagnetic profile of a massive B-52 bomber. On the Russian gravestone radar screens at Khrushchev 6, the world suddenly went crazy. The operators did not see 2 small decoys gliding in from the south. Their screens showed a full American-style strike package coming in hot at 25,000 feet. The base woke up with a mechanical scream as the Klaxon air raid sirens tore through the freezing darkness. The S-400 crews, fueled by adrenaline and a year of propaganda about NATO aggression, reacted exactly how Ukraine wanted them to. They saw the threat, locked onto the high-altitude Ghosts, and fired. 6 S-400 missiles, each costing roughly $2 million, roared off their rails, chasing electronic phantoms in the upper atmosphere. Each launch was a $2 million lottery ticket where the only prize was a puff of smoke. Ironically, the S-400 battery depleted its ready-fire tubes engaging targets that did not physically exist, leaving the sky clear for the real threat that was still skimming the treetops just 140 feet off the ground. With the S-400 battery now effectively offline and its crews confused by the lack of debris from their kills, the window of opportunity cracked open. The Russian operators were high-fiving over shooting down what they thought were NATO fighters, completely unaware that they had just wasted $12 million on flying decoys while their launch tubes were now empty and required a 45-minute reload cycle. This is the brutal economics of modern warfare. Ukraine spent a fraction of the cost to force Russia to expend its most valuable defensive assets. But the Wild Weasel was only the opening act. Hovering just behind it in the darkness was F-16 No. 2, call sign the Sniper, carrying the heavy hitters that were about to turn Putin's hypersonic pride into a 1,000-degree barbecue. The 6 Lyuty drones of the first wave were now crossing the final dead zone, the 10-mile perimeter around Khrushchev 6. But here is where the Ukrainian chess move became even more surgical. As they approached the inner ring of defenses, the flight computers on the drones triggered a pop-up maneuver, climbing rapidly to 300 feet. Why would they break stealth now? Because they wanted to be seen. They were acting as the ultimate clay pigeons to saturate the short-range defenses. Immediately, the Panzer S-1 and Tor M2 systems, the bodyguards of the Oreshnik battery, screeched into action, their turrets swiveling to engage the sudden appearance of 6 hostile contacts. The sky above the airbase turned into a chaotic wall of lead and fire as dual 30mm cannons pumped out 4,000 rounds per minute. The trap was sprung, the long-range radar was empty, and the short-range guns were now fully distracted by cheap gasoline-powered bait. This is what military analysts refer to as saturation, a brutal mathematical reality that no amount of propaganda can overcome. A Panzer S-1 system is a marvel of engineering, capable of tracking up to 4 targets simultaneously, but its computer processor has a hard limit, and its missile rails only hold 12 interceptors. By throwing 6 Lyuty drones into the mix at the exact same moment, Ukraine forced the Russian bodyguards to focus every available sensor and every round of ammunition on $15,000 gasoline-powered bait. The Russian gunners, their adrenaline spiking, were screaming commands over the radio, slewing their turrets to track the incoming drones that were intentionally flying slow enough to be engaged. They were celebrating each hit, watching the balls of fire erupt in the sky, completely oblivious to the fact that they were being played. While they were busy high-fiving over shooting down glorified model airplanes, they failed to notice that their search radars were completely occupied and their ready-fire ammunition racks were rapidly clicking down to 0. They were looking at the distraction in front of their faces, while the executioner was already loitering 60 miles away, preparing to deliver a package that would make their victory over the drones irrelevant. Enter the second F-16, call sign the Sniper. While the Wild Weasel had been loud and distracting, the Sniper was a ghost, staying low and quiet, waiting for the exact millisecond the Russian inner ring defense was fully saturated. The pilot of the Sniper flipped the safety cover on the weapon release switch, his thumb hovering over the button that would initiate the terminal phase of the operation. Under the wings of his aircraft sat 4 AGM-158 JASSMERs, the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles. These were not just dumb iron bombs. They were $1.3 million stealth cruise missiles with a 600-mile range and a body made of advanced radar-absorbent composites shaped like a flat diamond to deflect radar waves away from the sender. To a Russian radar, even if it were looking in the right direction, this 14-foot-long missile has the radar cross-section of a literal soda can. The pilot picked his moment and released the weapons. 4 JASSMERs dropped from the pylons, their small wings snapping open with a distinctive mechanical thwack before their turbojet engines ignited. They did not climb for altitude. Instead, they dropped even lower than the drones, hugging the terrain at just 50 feet above the ground. Guided by an internal digital map and a military-grade inertial navigation system that is immune to jamming, they ghosted past the distracted Panzer crews at 600 miles per hour. The Russian defenders were still busy reloading their guns after shooting down the first wave of drones, laughing about their easy victory, completely unaware that 4 stealth missiles carrying 1,000-pound armor-piercing penetrator warheads were 90 seconds away from their front door. Inside the nose of each JASSMER was an imaging infrared seeker that had been preloaded with a digital thermal model of the Khrushchev-6 bunker. Even if the Russians had turned on every GPS jammers between Minsk and Moscow, these missiles would not have cared because they were navigating by sight, matching the heat signature of the ventilation shafts against their internal database. As the missiles approached the target area, the onboard computers made a 0.5-degree course correction to align perfectly with the bunker structures. The first missile slammed into bunker number 1, but it did not explode on impact. That would have been too simple and far less destructive. Instead, it utilized a specialized FMU-152 joint programmable fuse, a smart brain that calculates deceleration as the hardened nose cone punches through 20 feet of reinforced concrete and soil. The initial 1,000-pound blast was just the spark. The real horror began when the Oreshnik solid fuel ignited. Unlike liquid fuel, which can sometimes be suppressed or drained, the propellant in these hypersonic missiles is a high-energy mixture of aluminum powder and ammonium perchlorate, essentially a 40-foot stick of dynamite that burns at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Within milliseconds, the bunker ceased to be a storage facility and became a pressurized oven generating energy equivalent to a small tactical nuke. The steel hangar doors, weighing several tons each, were blown off their hinges like sheets of wet paper, flying 300 yards into the surrounding forest from Shuang and shearing through pine trees like shrapnel. A column of white-hot violet flame erupted through the ruptured roof of the bunker, piercing the low cloud layer and lighting up the countryside for miles. But Ukraine was not finished with the destruction. The plan accounted for the fact that the Oreshnik launchers were mobile and that some might try to escape the inferno. As 2 of the massive launch vehicles desperately lumbered out of bunker number 4, their tires smoking as they raced for the tree line, the second wave of drones arrived. These were the 4 kill drones, which had been loitering in the thermal updrafts created by the fires, circling like vultures waiting for a wounded animal to break cover. Through their low-light cameras, the Ukrainian operators in Chernihiv saw the escaping trucks perfectly against the backdrop of the burning base. The order was given to engage, and the first drone rolled into a terminal dive, aiming not for the armored cab, but for the exposed missile canister on the back of the transporter. The first drone struck the missile canister of the lead truck with a 75-pound shaped charge warhead. The impact did not just disable the vehicle, it triggered the warhead inside the Oreshnik missile it was carrying. The resulting secondary explosion was so violent that it flipped the 50-ton transporter onto its side like a child's toy, tossing the chassis 30 feet into the air before it crashed down in a twisted heap of burning metal. The second, third, and fourth drones followed suit, hunting down the remaining support vehicles and fuel tankers that were trying to scramble away from the devastation. In the Ukrainian command center, there were no cheers yet, just the rhythmic clicking of technicians recording the seismic data streaming in from the sensors across the border. The impact was confirmed. Target Khrushchev-6 was no longer a functional military asset. The structural compromise was 100%. The Russian battery commander, if he survived the initial blast, was now looking at a crater where his career used to be. The Sniper and Wild Weasel F-16s banked hard to the west, their afterburners kicking in as they raced back toward friendly airspace. Behind them, the horizon was glowing a deep, angry orange. They did not just win a dogfight, they had performed a 16-minute lobotomy on Russia's strategic deterrent. Putin's wonder weapon did not fail because it was intercepted at Mach 10. It failed because it was too arrogant to realize that in modern war, a $15,000 drone and a clever pilot do not care about your speed. They only care about your footprint. The Oreshnik battery is gone, but as the smoke clears and the sun begins to rise over the devastated landscape of eastern Belarus, the true strategic nightmare for Moscow is just beginning to take shape. You do not just open a catalog and order another battery of hypersonic missiles to replace the ones that are now smoldering heaps of twisted metal. These systems are the Ferraris of the missile world, hand-built, incredibly complex, and reliant on high-end components that are currently strangled by global sanctions. By neutralizing all 10 launchers in a single morning, Ukraine did not just win a battle, they effectively deleted an entire year of Russian strategic manufacturing capacity. Production line for the Oreshnik is not an automated factory floor. It is a slow, painstaking laboratory environment where technicians in white coats assemble guidance chips and solid fuel motors by hand. To put that in Wall Street terms, Moscow just saw a 100% loss on a multi-billion-dollar investment before the product even reached the market. The sheer economic disparity of the exchange is staggering. The total cost of the Ukrainian operation, including the flight hours for the jets, the fuel, the MAL-J decoys, the JSM-ER missiles, and the drones, comes in at roughly $25 million. In exchange, they destroyed an estimated $2.5 billion worth of irreplaceable hardware. For months, President Putin had used the Oreshnik as a geopolitical shadow puppet, scaring European capitals with tales of Mach 10 uninterceptable destruction and threatening to turn major cities into dust. However, Ukraine just proved a fundamental truth of modern warfare that no amount of propaganda can hide. A missile does not have to be intercepted at Mach 10 if you can turn it into a thermal event while it is still sitting in its garage. Once it becomes a bonfire visible from space, it is just a costly liability and a monument to failed doctrine. The psychological impact of this strike is perhaps even more damaging than the physical loss. The image of the invincible Russian missile system burning helplessly on the ground shatters the myth of technological superiority that the Kremlin has spent decades cultivating. NATO planners, who had been scrambling to develop expensive interceptors to counter the hypersonic threat, are now looking at satellite photos of the wreckage and realizing that the most effective countermeasure was not a faster missile but better intelligence and the audacity to strike the archer before he could draw his bow. The destruction of Krychev 6 forces a complete rewrite of Russian deployment strategies, forcing them to pull their high-value assets deeper into their own territory, reducing their effective range and giving Ukraine and its allies more breathing room. This operation also highlighted a critical vulnerability in the Russian defensive philosophy: over-reliance on active radar. The entire defense of Krychev 6 was predicated on the S-400 seeing the enemy coming. But by using passive navigation, terrain masking, and electronic deception, Ukraine effectively blinded the giant. The S-400 is designed to fight a conventional war against high-flying jets, not a hybrid war against plastic drones and stealth cruise missiles that fly lower than the tree line. And if you support the smart guys in blue and yellow changing the rules of the game and teaching the world that ingenuity beats brute force every time, smash that like button and subscribe. Because in this theater of war, the biggest weapon is not a hypersonic missile, it is the intelligence to know exactly when to strike. At 0247 local time, 5 Ukrainian FP-2 strike drones are screaming through the freezing darkness of occupied Crimea at 120 kilometers per hour. Their target is a Russian logistics train currently thundering toward a supply depot that is destined to swallow it in exactly 87 minutes. The drones have precisely that long to traverse 160 kilometers of the most hostile airspace on the planet, locate the moving target, and destroy it before it reaches the safety of the depot's air defense umbrella. The mathematics of this intercept are brutal, leaving zero margin for error. If the drones arrive 30 seconds late, the train will be under the protection of a Panzer S-1 battery. If they arrive 30 seconds early, they will run out of battery power before the target enters the engagement zone. The mission planners have calculated the fuel-to-weight ratio down to the gram, stripping every non-essential component from the airframes to squeeze out an extra 3 minutes of flight time. These are not commercial quadcopters bought from a hobby store. They are purpose-built loitering munitions, flying fuel tanks with wings, carrying just enough high explosive to turn a bad night into a catastrophic one for the Russian Logistics Command. But 40 kilometers ahead, a Russian Kosta 2E2 radar operator is about to make that math significantly harder. The Russian air defense network in this sector is anchored by the Kosta 2E2, a low-altitude surveillance radar specifically designed to detect targets just like these. The massive antenna rotates every 4 seconds, its beam sweeping north at the speed of light, painting the sky with electromagnetic energy. Inside the control cabin, the operator watches his screen fill with hundreds of contacts. The radar is sensitive enough to pick up a delivery truck moving on the M18 highway or a water tower vibrating in the wind near Armyansk. It even picks up flocks of migratory birds scattering weak radar returns that flicker and vanish like ghosts in the machine. There are 300 blips demanding his attention on every single sweep of the northern sector. It is a visual cacophony of noise, and his job is to find the signal within that noise. At 0248, he spots a faint return 38 kilometers out, moving south at a steady 120 kilometers per hour. He leans forward, his eyes narrowing. At low altitude, radar sees everything, including ground clutter, cars, and weather patterns. To make sense of this chaos, the system relies on the Doppler shift, the same principle of physics that makes an ambulance siren sound higher as it approaches you and lower as it drives away. The radar waves emitted by the Kosta system bounce off objects and return to the receiver. Stationary objects reflect the waves at the exact original frequency, allowing the computer to filter them out as background noise. Moving objects, however, compress the waves as they approach, creating a frequency shift that the computer translates into a velocity vector. This is how the system separates a moving aircraft from a stationary mountain. But here is the problem that keeps radar engineers awake at night. A drone flying at 120 kilometers per hour creates a frequency shift that is almost mathematically identical to a speeding car on the highway directly below it. Furthermore, a dense flock of birds looks almost indistinguishable from a small drone dipping in and out of the terrain. When a contact appears on one sweep, vanishes on the next because of a hill, and shows up somewhere else on the third, the computer has to make a statistical guess. Usually, the algorithm guesses wildlife or ground traffic and discards the track. The operator can override that judgment, but only if he has a concrete reason to doubt the machine. And right now, staring at that faint blip, he has a reason. There should be absolutely no authorized air traffic in this sector at this hour. The contact appears again on the next sweep, maintaining the same heading and the same speed. It is now 36 kilometers out. The operator's finger moves toward the alert key. 170 kilometers south, the Russian fuel train passes a checkpoint, completely unaware that it is being hunted. The window for the intercept has now dropped to 82 minutes, and the margin of error is shrinking with every revolution of the radar antenna. On the third sweep, the contact is still there, 35 kilometers now, closing steadily. The operator's hand hovers over the red button that would wake up the entire Crimean air defense network. If he presses it, he triggers a chain reaction. Surface-to-air missile batteries will power up their engagement radars, electronic warfare units will flood the spectrum with noise, and interceptor aircraft will be scrambled. But if he is wrong, he will have just woken up his commanding officer at 3 in the morning for a flock of geese. He decides to wait for one more clean sweep to confirm the track. He watches the green line of the antenna sweep complete its rotation, the beam washing across the northern sector with the inevitability of a ticking clock. But this time, the screen shows nothing. The contact is gone. The drone did not vanish. It simply dropped into a shallow valley 4 kilometers long, a geological wrinkle that Ukrainian mission planners identified from satellite imagery weeks ago. Radar waves travel in straight lines, but the Earth curves away beneath them. A radar transmitter mounted 14 meters tall can only see targets that are above the radar horizon. If a target drops below that geometric line, behind a ridge or into a valley, the radar beam passes harmlessly overhead like sunlight passing over a shadow. This is the fundamental weakness of all ground-based radar systems. The Ukrainian pilots are flying their machines at the very edge of the flight envelope, hugging the terrain so closely that the drone's camera feed is filled with rushing grass and treetops. They are betting their lives and their mission on a few meters of altitude and the curvature of the Earth. The operator in the radar van waits. The fourth sweep comes and goes. Nothing. The fifth sweep reveals a momentary blip on the far side of the valley, but the track has been broken for too long. The computer's algorithm reclassifies the contact as probable wildlife. The satellites are still there, orbiting silently in the vacuum, but the drones simply cannot hear them anymore. This is the killing zone where Ukraine loses hundreds of drones every single month. Without GPS, cheap commercial quadcopters have absolutely no idea where they are in three-dimensional space. They wander off course, pushed by the wind, drifting aimlessly until their batteries drain and they drop into empty fields where nobody will ever find them. The video feed usually just goes dark as the link is severed, but the FP2 was built for exactly this problem. The moment the GPS signal fails, the drone's flight computer switches logic states. 3-ring laser gyroscopes and 3 precision accelerometers take over the navigation duties. The gyroscopes measure rotation by racing 2 laser beams around a triangular path of glass. When the drone turns, one beam has to travel slightly farther than the other, creating a microscopic frequency shift measured in billionths of a meter. There are no moving parts, no gears to jam, just light racing around a glass block, measuring every single degree of turn the aircraft makes. Simultaneously, the accelerometers track velocity changes by measuring how a tiny internal mass shifts against microscopic springs. The navigation computer fuses all this raw data together, continuously updating the drone's position based on the last known valid GPS fix. This is known as dead reckoning, or inertial navigation. The math is elegant, but the problem is drift. Small sensor errors accumulate over time. A gyroscope measuring 0.01 degrees per second of rotation when the drone is actually flying straight adds up to 36 degrees of phantom rotation over an hour. An accelerometer with a tiny bias, maybe 0.001 g, accumulates as phantom velocity, which then becomes phantom distance. The navigation computer uses a complex algorithm called a Kalman filter to minimize these errors, continuously weighing each sensor's reliability against the others and calculating the most probable position. But even the best filter cannot eliminate drift entirely. Over a 90-minute flight, the position uncertainty can grow to 5 or even 8 kilometers, which is enough to miss a target entirely if you are flying autonomously to a set of coordinates. But the FP2 is not autonomous. The operator can still see live video from the nose camera via a frequency-hopping analog link that is much harder to jam than GPS. He will steer by eye when it counts. He just needs the instruments to get him close enough to find the train track. The massive jamming network blanketing Crimea, designed to knock sophisticated drones out of the sky, might as well be an expensive radio station playing static to an audience that is not listening. The fuel remaining drops to 54%. The inertial navigation system uncertainty is now 2.8 kilometers. The train is 52 kilometers from the depot. The window is still open, but the electronic warfare environment is about to shift from brute force noise to something much more subtle and dangerous. Then something unexpected happens. The GPS indicator on the drone's heads-up display flickers back to life. Signal acquired. 4 satellites locked. Position fix valid. The operator frowns, his eyes darting between the map and the video feed. Jamming this deep into the Crimean Peninsula typically runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are no gaps, no maintenance windows, and no mistakes. The drone did not climb in altitude, and it did not cross into clear airspace. Nothing about the environment has changed, yet the signal is back. Then he looks closely at the coordinates streaming onto his screen. According to the GPS data, his drone is currently flying 12 kilometers east of where the camera feed shows it should be. The roads visible in the live video do not match the road network at the GPS position. A water tower clearly visible in the feed does not exist at those coordinates. Nothing lines up. This is not jamming. Jamming merely drowns the signal in noise. This is something far more insidious. This is a GPS spoofer, a sophisticated electronic warfare attack that broadcasts fake satellite signals to deceive the navigation system. The mechanism is terrifyingly simple and effective. A GPS receiver calculates its position by measuring the precise time delay of signals arriving from multiple satellites orbiting 20,000 kilometers away. By comparing these nanosecond-level delays, the receiver triangulates its location on the Earth's surface. A spoofer works by transmitting an identical signal structure but with false timing data. If you change those timing values by just a few nanoseconds, you shift the calculated position by meters. If you change them by microseconds, you shift the position by kilometers. The drone's receiver locks onto the lie because the ground-based transmitter is much closer and pumps out a signal that is orders of magnitude stronger than the faint whisper coming from space. It captures the receiver's attention like a megaphone drowning out a conversation. An autonomous drone trusting those false coordinates would immediately turn to correct its course, flying toward a phantom destination that does not exist. A sophisticated spoofer can even feed fake altitude data into the equation, convincing the drone's autopilot that it is 500 meters higher than it actually is. The autopilot, believing it is too high, would command a dive to correct the error, driving the aircraft straight into the ground at cruise speed. The Russians built this system to take out Ukrainian drones without firing a single shot or launching a single missile. It is elegant, cheap, and highly effective against commercial systems. However, against the FP2 with its inertial measurement unit, it is completely useless. Those backup instruments never stopped running. When the GPS receiver suddenly claims the drone teleported 12 kilometers to the east without the accelerometers detecting any lateral movement and without the gyroscopes registering a turn, the navigation computer knows the satellite signals are lying. Physical objects do not teleport. Newton's laws of motion are absolute, and the math does not lie even when the electromagnetic signals do. But the Russian spoofers have another weakness that the Ukrainian software exploits. Real GPS signals come from satellites scattered across the entire dome of the sky, each signal arriving at the drone's antenna from a different angle. A ground-based spoofer broadcasts all its fake signals from a single location on the ground. This means every satellite signal the drone hears is arriving from the exact same direction at the exact same time. The Ukrainian navigation software runs a continuous sanity check for this anomaly. If the signal geometry collapses to a single point, the system knows it is being spoofed. The spoof signals fail the test immediately. The operator toggles the GPS input off, discarding the false coordinates. The system reverts to the backup instruments. The uncertainty circle begins to grow again, but honest uncertainty is tactically superior to a confident lie. Behind the locomotive are rectangular shapes in a long line. Tank cars. They are glowing faintly, not from their own heat, but from the residual warmth of the liquid fuel inside, which retains heat longer than the steel shell containing it. He counts them as they slide past his camera. 23 cars. That is roughly 1,600 tons of diesel and aviation gas that will never reach the Russian forward units if he has anything to say about it. But the target is closer to the depot than he had hoped. It is 20 kilometers out, rolling at 40 kilometers per hour. He calculates he has maybe 4 minutes before the train reaches the effective range of the depot's air defenses. He has a critical tactical choice to make. He can wait for the train to stop at the depot and strike a stationary target, which offers easy geometry and a high probability of a hit. Or he can strike now while it is moving. Striking a moving train is exponentially harder, but if he succeeds, the burning wreckage will block the main rail line for days, crippling logistics far beyond just the loss of the fuel. He chooses to strike now, but that is much easier said than done. Most long-range strike drones fly autonomously to fixed GPS coordinates. They hit buildings, parked aircraft, or fuel tanks, anything that holds still. But a train moving at 40 kilometers per hour covers 330 meters during the 30 seconds of a drone's final approach. GPS guidance would miss by 3 football fields. The FP2 keeps a human in the loop until the moment of impact, allowing the pilot to steer by eye toward a target that refuses to stop moving. 170 kilometers away in Kherson, the operator's video feed travels through a relay drone orbiting at high altitude. This second drone acts as a mirror in the sky, bending the signal around the curvature of the Earth to maintain the connection. When the operator nudges his joystick, the command signal travels up to the relay, down to the FP2, and into the flight computer. This signal path introduces roughly 200 milliseconds of latency. That sounds instant, but at 120 kilometers per hour, the drone travels nearly 7 meters in that time. The operator has to lead his inputs, aiming where the target will be, not where it is currently on his screen. He drops the drone to 20 meters, a grass-cutting altitude that makes him invisible to most search radars. He pulls the throttle back to match the train's speed, settling into a position 400 meters behind and closing. Inside the locomotive cab, the engineer has absolutely no idea what is coming for him. His instruments show a quiet night. Green lights glow across every panel. The fuel pressure is steady. The speed is holding perfectly at 40 kilometers per hour. Through his wide windscreen, he sees only dark fields, distant village lights, and stars scattered across a clear winter sky. The rumble of 4,000 tons of rolling stock behind him drowns out everything else. He has been running this exact route for 3 months. It is always the same schedule, the same checkpoints, and the same radio calls. Tonight was supposed to be completely routine. The depot was just 12 kilometers away. In 4 minutes, he would hand off the cargo, grab a hot coffee, and wait for the return run instructions. He had no idea that those 4 minutes would never arrive. If he knew exactly where to look and had infrared vision, he might have glimpsed a dark shape crossing the stars behind him. But he does not know. The drone is now 200 meters behind, then 100. The operator picks his specific target. He selects the third tank car behind the locomotive. This spot is chosen carefully. It is far enough back that the impact won't just derail the engine and let the rest coast free, but close enough that the fire will spread in both directions. Fuel remaining is now at 19%. The distance closes to 50 meters. The crosshairs are locked on the rear of the tank car. The second FP2 is 800 meters behind the first, lining up on a different car to ensure redundancy. The third drone is angling towards the rear of the train. The fourth and fifth drones have already broken south toward the depot itself, 12 kilometers ahead. And unfortunately, they have been detected. The depot's Panzer S1 air defense system picks them up on its thermal imaging camera at a range of 8 kilometers. Two small heat signatures approaching at 120 kilometers per hour, altitude 20 meters. The radar, designed to track cruise missiles and fighter jets, initially filters them out as ground clutter, but the thermal camera does not lie. The operator inside the Panzer screams a warning and switches to electro-optical tracking mode, manually slewing the turret toward the incoming threats. The Panzer S1 operator is tracking manually through what amounts to be a very expensive telescope with guns attached. His twin 2A38M autocannons can pump out 5,000 rounds per minute, a rate of fire so intense it sounds less like a machine gun and more like canvas tearing. At this range, he has maybe 15 seconds of effective engagement time before the drones reach the minimum range of 500 meters, where the guns physically cannot depress low enough to track targets skimming the grass. Every weapon system has geometry limits, and the Panzer is no exception. Its turret can depress to -5 degrees, which means anything flying below that angle relative to the horizon becomes untouchable. The system was designed to kill cruise missiles and aircraft approaching from above, not dinner plate-sized targets hugging the terrain like hovercraft. He opens fire. The 30mm rounds use programmable airburst fusing. A tiny radar in the nose of each shell measures the distance to the target. When it matches the preset value, the round detonates. Each shell fragments into roughly 400 pieces of tungsten and steel shrapnel, expanding in a 4-meter sphere of destruction. At 5,000 rounds per minute, he is creating overlapping destruction zones faster than the drones can fly through them. The fourth drone vanishes at 2,100 meters, shrapnel shredding its lithium-ion battery pack and sending it tumbling into the dirt. One down. The fifth drone immediately drops to an altitude of 10 meters and jinks hard left, slipping below the Panzer's depression limit and using the rolling terrain as hard cover. The gunner tries to reacquire the target, traversing his turret frantically, but the barrels are already glowing cherry red from the sustained burst. At 5,000 rounds per minute, each barrel is cycling 40 times per second, and the friction of brass cartridges combined with the heat of burning propellant adds up fast. Steel barrels start losing their temper around 400 degrees Celsius. The rifling grooves that spin the rounds for accuracy begin to erode and then deform under the stress. He has to cease fire to let the barrels cool. The manual mandates a 12-second cooling period after a full burst. The fifth drone pushes through the gap during those 12 seconds. Fuel remaining is at 7%. The depot's storage tanks loom in the thermal display, massive cylindrical shapes behind concrete walls designed to contain liquid spills, not deflect high-velocity warheads. 3 minutes from the depot. Everything is lined up. It is now or never. Back at the rail line, the first FP2 strikes the third tank car at precisely 03:57 local time. The 1.5 kilogram shaped charge warhead does not just explode, it focuses all its energy into a jet of molten metal moving at hypersonic speed. It punches through the 15mm steel wall of the tank car and into the 40,000 liters of diesel fuel inside. The physics of what happens next is terrifying. The kinetic energy of the jet creates a shockwave that travels through the liquid at the speed of sound. Diesel fuel does not typically detonate like gasoline, it burns. But 40,000 liters of diesel vaporizing instantly inside a ruptured pressure vessel makes that distinction purely academic. The pressure inside the tank spikes to thousands of atmospheres in a millisecond. The steel shell fails catastrophically, ripping open along its welded seams. The fuel sprays into the void, mixes with oxygen in the air to reach the perfect stoichiometric ratio, and ignites. The temperature at the center of the fireball exceeds 1,000 degrees Celsius. Steel softens and loses structural integrity at 500 degrees. Inside the locomotive cab, the engineer is thrown violently against his console by the concussive force. Warning lights cascade across every panel in the cabin. Through his rear window, he sees orange light painting the night sky, his cargo transforming into a wall of fire behind him. He reaches for the radio handset to report the strike. The depot needs to know they are under attack, but the second FP2 hits before he can even key the microphone. With the train immobilized by the first blast, the geometry for the second drone becomes simple. The second operator picks a car near the rear of the train to spread the destruction and ensure nothing survives. Impact. Another massive fireball climbs into the December night, merging with the first one. The third drone follows exactly 8 seconds later, striking the dead center of the formation. The 3 strikes have now turned the rail line into a continuous corridor of burning fuel stretching 400 meters in both directions. The heat is so intense it creates its own weather system, sucking in oxygen from the surrounding fields to feed the inferno. Meanwhile, 12 kilometers south, the 5th drone is on its final approach to the supply depot. The operator picks his target carefully, the central fuel distribution manifold. With nowhere to store fuel, the pipes that move fuel from rail cars to storage tanks and then to trucks are worthless. Distance is 200 meters. The battery warning flashes red on his screen. 4% remaining. 100 meters, 3%. The motor's cut out completely at 50 meters from the target. The propellers windmill uselessly in the airstream, no longer generating thrust. But the drone is still a projectile moving at 120 kilometers per hour or 33 meters per second, with minimal frontal area drag. The disabled drone coasts home on physics alone. The strategic fallout is immediate and severe. The destruction of the train and the depot removes roughly 2,000 tons of fuel from the Russian logistics network in a single night. That is enough diesel to keep a reinforced tank battalion operational for 2 weeks of heavy combat. More importantly, the burning wreckage on the main line means no other trains can pass this sector for at least 72 hours. Russian engineering brigades will have to wait for the fire to burn itself out, then clear the twisted steel, then replace the warped rails and melted ties. That is 3 days where the frontline units this train was supplying are burning their reserves without replenishment. If they are engaged in high-intensity combat, 3 days without fuel is not an inconvenience. It is a death sentence. A tank without fuel is just a pillbox that cannot move. A truck without fuel cannot bring ammunition to the artillery. The ripple effects will be felt across the entire southern front. Then there is the financial return on investment, which is a nightmare for Moscow's accountants. The 5 Ukrainian FP2 drones cost roughly $2,000 each. The entire strike package, including the relays and ground support, cost maybe $25,000. In exchange, they destroyed a locomotive worth $3 million, 23 tank cars worth another $2 million, and fuel worth roughly $1.5 million. The damage to the depot infrastructure will cost millions more to repair. But the real cost isn't the hardware, it is the inefficiency. Every time Russia has to reroute a train, add extra air defense to a convoy, or stop operations because of a drone threat, the cost of the war increases while their combat effectiveness decreases. It is a form of economic attrition that no amount of oil revenue can fully offset. This raid demonstrates the terrifying asymmetry of modern drone warfare. You do not need air superiority to destroy an enemy's logistics. You do not need million-dollar cruise missiles or stealth bombers. You just need cheap consumer electronics, a little bit of engineering ingenuity, and operators who understand physics better than the enemy's radar does. The Russian military can build all the jammers and missile systems it wants. But as long as a 4-kilometer valley exists to hide a drone, and as long as a radar operator has to blink, the fuel trains will keep burning. The operator in Kherson disconnects from the relay feed. He stands up, stretches his back, and walks out of the bunker into the dawn light. He has a coffee to finish, and the Russians have a very long day ahead of them. At 2:17 in the morning, the air over Engels 2 airbase feels unnaturally still, the kind of silence that exists only before something irreversible happens. On the northern hardstand, a 160M sits exposed under open sky, its white fuselage glowing faintly under maintenance lights like a museum piece misplaced in the wrong century. This aircraft was once flown across oceans to signal dominance. Its presence alone meant to bend political conversations before they even began. Tonight, that mythology is irrelevant. What matters is that the bomber is wounded, immobile, and parked where doctrine says it should never be. 48 hours earlier, a calculated Ukrainian strike forced this exact outcome, clipping the aircraft just enough to ground it without destroying it, creating the illusion of survival while quietly setting the trap. Russian logistics, already stretched thin, failed to move it into hardened shelter. The most expensive symbol in the inventory now waits in the open, undergoing emergency repairs. Its value measured not only in money but in strategic confidence. The bomber is not alone. Nearby, hardened storage bunkers hold dozens of key H-101 cruise missiles, weapons designed for long-range winter strikes meant to grind civilian infrastructure into darkness. Each missile represents a calculated suffering, a planned night without heat, without light. By placing the aircraft and the stockpile within the same defensive bubble, Russian planners believed they were maximizing protection. Instead, they concentrated risk. Ukraine understood this geometry perfectly. This was never about a single aircraft. It was about compressing multiple layers of Russian strategy into one vulnerable node. From a command room hundreds of miles away, Ukrainian operators watched live feeds with clinical calm. This was not a gamble. Every variable, from repair timelines to guard rotations to radar coverage gaps, had been modeled and stress-tested. The bomber was bait, but the missiles were the true prize. Far beyond the perimeter fence, low over the Volga River, the first phase was already moving. Small reconnaissance drones skimmed just above the waterline, their electric motors nearly silent, using fog and riverbank clutter as natural camouflage. They were not searching broadly. They were looking for one specific silhouette, confirming that the aircraft had not been moved, that the opportunity still existed. Russian air defenses above them scanned the upper atmosphere, confident in their reach, blind to what hugged the earth. This imbalance between expectation and reality defined the night. Strategic air defense systems built to counter high-altitude threats were being bypassed by machines flying lower than birds, exploiting the curvature of terrain and the assumptions baked into decades-old doctrine. As confirmation came in, the second layer unfolded. Dozens of strike drones launched on a one-way flight, navigating autonomously across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Their cost was trivial compared to what they were aimed at, a disparity that would have seemed absurd only a few years earlier. These drones did not race directly toward the base. They followed the river, weaving through terrain features, adjusting altitude dynamically, never presenting a clean radar profile. At the same time, a separate group climbed aggressively, broadcasting signatures designed to look like high-end cruise missiles. Russian sensors reacted exactly as predicted. Alerts cascaded through command vehicles. Decisions were made in seconds. Interceptor missiles worth millions were launched upward, chasing decoys that existed only to be destroyed. From the Russian perspective, the system was working. From the Ukrainian perspective, the most dangerous eyes in the sky had just been deliberately distracted. While attention tilted upward, the base's closer defenses began to struggle. Short-range systems, designed to counter saturation attacks, were suddenly flooded with conflicting data. Environmental noise from the river, electronic residue from destroyed decoys, and the emergence of dozens of low-altitude targets created a computational storm. Operators tried to prioritize, but doctrine pulled their focus back to the bomber itself, the symbol that could not be lost. Turrets elevated, scanning above, guarding against a threat that was no longer there. In that narrow window, corridors at ground level opened. The defenses were not defeated by brute force. They were misled, coerced into protecting the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment. This was not chaos, it was choreography, and the most dangerous movement had not even reached the stage yet. The moment the decoys burn out high above the base, the real attack slips through like a knife under a rib. At ground level, Russian defenses are pointed the wrong way, chasing ghosts in the sky while the real threat is already inside the fence line. 50 Ukrainian strike drones skim across the landscape at treetop height, moving fast, steady, and ruthless. They are not improvising. Every meter of this approach was rehearsed digitally long before a single propeller spun. These drones are not brave and they are not scared. They are obedient. They follow terrain, cut speed where radar noise spikes, then accelerate through blind zones with mechanical confidence. This is not a swarm hoping to overwhelm by luck. It is a precision tool built to exploit Russian habits, Russian training, and Russian pride. The air defense crews believe they have won the opening exchange. That belief is about to cost them everything. Inside the base perimeter, confusion spreads faster than any alarm. Radar operators are drowning in data they cannot cleanly interpret. Visual spotters are staring into fog lit by tracer fire from their own guns. Orders overlap. No one wants to be the officer who lets the White Swan die, so all attention stays locked on the bomber. This is the fatal mistake. The defenses behave exactly as Ukraine predicted, clustering around the symbol instead of the system. Meanwhile, 40 drones split off, sliding east along the tarmac, low enough to scrape paint, heading straight for the missile bunkers. These are not secondary targets. They are the spine of Russia's winter strike plan. Each missile destroyed here erases weeks of terror elsewhere. This is not destruction for spectacle. This is subtraction, cold and deliberate. The short-range gun systems finally engage, but they are already behind the curve. Triggers are held down in panic, not discipline. Thousands of rounds tear into the night, turning the air into a glowing grid of metal. Drones explode, tumble, or cartwheel across concrete, and Russian crews cheer every hit, believing volume equals victory. They do not understand what is happening in the background. Every drone lost feeds data into the remaining swarm. Firing patterns, reload pauses, wind shifts, turret lag, all of it is shared instantly. The surviving drones adapt mid-flight, changing altitude by meters, timing runs between bursts, sliding through gaps measured in seconds. This is not heroism, it is math, and math does not care how loud you shoot. When the first drones slam into the missile bunker doors, the night changes character. Steel buckles, fuel ignites, heat spikes beyond control. Inside, missile casings begin to cook off one by one, not as clean explosions, but as violent internal failures that tear the storage space apart. Guidance systems melt, frames warp. This is not damage that can be repaired. This is inventory erased. In under a minute, a month of planned strikes becomes toxic scrap. Russian command realizes too late that the bomber was never the main target. It was the distraction that pulled every shield out of position. The real loss is happening off to the side, unnoticed until the fireball tells the truth. And then the focus snaps back to the White Swan. But now it is alone. 10 drones remain, and they are not looking at wings or fuselage. They are hunting engines. The intakes glow hot in infrared, impossible to hide, perfect targets. Ground troops fire wildly, one even climbing onto a fuel truck to spray bullets into the dark, desperate and exposed. It does not matter. One drone hits, then another, punching shaped charges into spinning machinery. Compressor blades become shrapnel. Housings tear themselves apart from the inside. Hydraulic lines rupture. The bomber does not explode in a clean flash. It collapses mechanically, organs destroyed, structure betrayed by its own complexity. By the time defenses finally swat the last drone, the damage is irreversible. The White Swan is still standing, but it is dead where it sits. By 2:40 in the morning, the base is fully awake, but it is too late to matter. Emergency lights wash the tarmac in harsh white glare, illuminating smoke, twisted metal, and men running without direction. Russian quick reaction forces flood the hardstand, weapons raised, searching for attackers that no longer exist. Fighter jets scream off the runway minutes later, afterburners lighting the sky as they hunt radar ghosts across empty airspace. The response looks powerful, dramatic, and completely useless. The attack is already finished. Nothing is left to intercept. Nothing is left to save. What remains on the ground is the aftermath of a plan that worked exactly as designed. The Tu-160M is no longer a bomber. It is a broken airframe with its engines gutted, hydraulics bled dry, and flight systems destroyed from the inside. It will never fly again without years of work and resources Russia no longer has in surplus. The financial damage alone is brutal, but money is the least important part. Replacing those engines is not a simple procurement problem. They are hand-built, slow to produce, and dependent on supply chains now choked by sanctions and scarcity. Even under perfect conditions, recovery would take months. Under current conditions, it borders on fantasy. For the rest of the winter, that aircraft is nothing more than a massive white monument to miscalculation, parked where satellites can photograph it daily. Every image will tell the same story. The untouchable was touched, and it did not survive the encounter. The psychological weight of that image travels faster than any missile. Pilots see it, commanders see it, allies and rivals see it. The myth cracks in public view. The missile stockpile loss hits even harder. Dozens of key H-101 cruise missiles destroyed in a single window means hundreds of planned sorties quietly disappear from the calendar. Each missile removed is a power station that stays lit, a city that sleeps with heat, a family that does not spend the night in a basement listening for impact. This is what strategic subtraction looks like. Ukraine did not just block an attack. It erased future ones before launch orders were ever given. Russian planners now face gaps they cannot quickly fill. Production cannot accelerate overnight. Logistics cannot teleport. Winter does not wait. The strike does not change the war in one dramatic instant, but it bends the curve, forcing Russia to choose where it can no longer afford to strike. The ripple effect spreads immediately. Engels 2 was supposed to be safe, deep inside defended territory, protected by layered systems that made attack unthinkable. That illusion is gone. Within hours, aircraft begin dispersing to distant bases, pushed farther north, farther east, farther from targets. This is not a show of strength. It is defensive retreat dressed up as redeployment. Every extra mile flown adds wear, burns fuel, eats maintenance hours, and reduces time on station. Long-range bombers are powerful only when they are convenient. When they are forced to operate from the edges of the map, their value drops fast. Ukraine does not need to chase them there. Distance does the work. Inside Russian command circles, the questions turn uncomfortable. If a base like this can be penetrated, what cannot? If a bomber like this can be crippled on the ground, what does protection even mean anymore? The defenses did not fail because they were weak. They failed because they were predictable. They reacted exactly as trained, exactly as expected. And that predictability was used against them. This is the deeper damage. Fixing hardware is expensive. Fixing doctrine is harder. Every future decision now carries doubt. Every radar contact demands hesitation. Every alert risks being another decoy. That hesitation is where advantage lives. Ukraine never needed to fly the bomber away to win. The idea of stealing it was a psychological weapon, not an operational necessity. Russia lost confidence in its shield, trust in its procedures, and faith in symbols that once anchored its strategy. The White Swan was meant to project inevitability. Instead, it demonstrated vulnerability. In modern warfare, that reversal matters more than wreckage. The battlefield is no longer defined by who has the biggest machines, but by who understands how those machines think, react, and fail. And on this night, that understanding belonged entirely to Ukraine. Morning light does not soften the scene at Engels 2. It exposes it. Smoke stains the concrete. Burn marks cut across the hardstand like scars. The Tu-160M sits tilted and gutted, its engines torn open, panels warped, hydraulic fluid dried into dark streaks along the wings. This is not cosmetic damage. This is surgical ruin. Crews move around it slowly, carefully, like people walking through a wrecked building after an earthquake. No one is rushing to fix anything because there is nothing to fix quickly. Every technician on that apron understands the same brutal truth. This aircraft is not coming back online this season. It is out of the war, not because it was shot down in the air, but because it was humiliated on the ground. The reaction inside Russian command is sharp and panicked, even if the public language stays controlled. Emergency meetings follow emergency meetings. Reports are rewritten. Responsibility is blurred. No one wants their name attached to the moment the most protected bomber in the fleet became a stationary target. The air defense crews did what they were trained to do. That is the problem. They defended the symbol instead of the system. They protected what looked important and ignored what actually mattered. This is not a failure of courage. It is a failure of thinking, and thinking is much harder to replace than hardware. The financial math only deepens the wound. The cost of the bomber, the engines, the repairs, the wasted interceptors, and the destroyed missiles adds up fast, but the real cost is time. Months of repair work collide with months of winter operations. You cannot fly absence. You cannot launch what no longer exists. Every missing bomber sortie creates a hole in planning that cannot be patched with speeches or threats. Russia does not lose power all at once. It bleeds it slowly, decision by decision, delay by delay, until the pressure reverses direction. The destroyed missile stockpile is the quiet catastrophe. Those weapons were already built, fueled, and positioned. They were ready to fly. Now they are slag. Replacing them means reopening production lines that are already strained, sourcing components that are increasingly hard to find, and choosing between targets that all compete for shrinking resources. This forces trade-offs Russia does not want to make: strike cities or protect bases, pressure the front or defend the rear. Every option now costs more than before. That is what a successful strike really does. It does not just destroy, it complicates everything that comes after. Across the border, the impact feels different. There are no victory parades, no dramatic announcements. There is just a quieter winter night somewhere that would have been loud. Power stays on where it might not have. Trains run where they could have stopped. People sleep who might have been woken by sirens. This is the kind of result that never makes headlines on its own, but it stacks up over time. Strategic success is often invisible to the people it protects. That does not make it any less real. Militarily, the lesson spreads fast. Static defenses are no longer shields. They are puzzles waiting to be solved. Expensive systems designed for one kind of threat become liabilities when forced to fight another. The gap between cost and effect widens until it breaks logic itself. When a cheap drone can erase a weapon designed to last decades, prestige stops meaning much. What matters is adaptability, speed, and the willingness to abandon old assumptions before they turn into traps. The myth damage may be the hardest to repair. Russia spent years building the image of untouchable reach, of bombers that could go anywhere and strike anytime. That image relied on fear and distance. This operation collapses both. Distance did not protect the base. Fear did not stop the attack. Once that illusion cracks, it never fully reforms. Every future deployment carries the memory of this night. Every commander knows that what happened once can happen again, somewhere else at another time. This is how modern conflict shifts, not through massive offensives alone, but through moments that flip the logic of power. Ukraine did not overpower Russia. It outthought it. It did not chase symbols into the sky. It waited for them to sit still, then dismantled them piece by piece. That patience is its own weapon. It forces the opponent to defend everything while attacking selectively. Over time, that imbalance grows impossible to sustain. For Russia, the choice now is ugly. Pull defenses back to protect prestige assets and weaken the front, or leave them exposed and risk repetition. Either path leads to loss. There is no clean answer, only damage control. That is the mark of a successful strike. It removes good options and leaves only bad ones. From this point forward, every major asset on Russian soil carries a question mark over it. Not if it can be hit, but when. And that is why this moment matters. A bomber did not need to be stolen to be taken. Its power was removed where it stood. The message is simple and brutal. In this war, size does not guarantee safety. Cost does not equal protection. History does not stop drones flying low through fog. The White Swan was built to dominate the skies. It was defeated by patience, planning, and machines small enough to hide behind a riverbank. That is the future arriving without permission, and it is not slowing down. The shock waves do not stop at the fence line. They travel through every briefing room, every airbase, every planning document that still assumes rear areas are safe. That assumption is dead. From this point on, depth offers no comfort. Distance is no longer defense. Every runway, every fuel dump, every parked aircraft becomes a question mark. Guards look outward, but now also inward, wondering what they missed, what they misunderstood, what else might already be mapped and waiting. This is how pressure really works. It does not scream. It sits on the chest and makes every breath heavier. Russia can add more layers, more guns, more rules, but each layer adds friction, delay, and cost. The system grows heavier while the attacker stays light. What makes this strike truly dangerous is that it is repeatable. Nothing about it was unique or unrepeatable. No miracle technology was revealed. No once-in-a-lifetime alignment of luck occurred. The tools are known. The methods are understood. The weaknesses are documented. That is what terrifies planners the most. This was not a fluke. It was a demonstration, a proof that the equation has changed and cannot be changed back easily. When defenders realize the attacker can do this again, somewhere else, the battlefield expands infinitely. You cannot guard everything all the time. Eventually, something important will blink. For Ukraine, this is not about spectacle or symbolism. It is about survival through leverage. When you cannot match scale, you attack confidence. When you cannot overwhelm, you isolate and dismantle. Each successful operation like this shifts negotiations that never happen publicly but always exist beneath the surface. It forces resources to move defensively instead of offensively. It drains momentum. It slows violence elsewhere. This is not desperation warfare. It is disciplined pressure applied where it hurts most, measured not in headlines, but in canceled missions and unused launch orders. The old model of war depended on hierarchy and mass. Big platforms, big budgets, big threats. That model is cracking under its own weight. What replaced it is uncomfortable and uneven. Small systems coordinated intelligently outperform large systems reacting rigidly. Speed beats armor. Learning beats doctrine. The side that adapts faster gains an edge that compounds. This is why nights like this matter more than territorial lines on a map. They reveal which military is evolving and which is clinging to habits formed for a different century. And the final truth is this. The bomber did not fail Russia. Russia's assumptions failed the bomber. The aircraft did exactly what it was designed to do, but the world around it changed faster than the doctrine protecting it. That is the warning written into the concrete at Engels 2. Power that refuses to adapt becomes a target. Symbols that cannot move become liabilities. And in this war, anything that can be seen, planned around, and waited on is already halfway to being destroyed. The future does not announce itself. It arrives low, quiet, and unforgiving. And by the time you look up, it is already over. The sky was still dark at 0502 hours when 5 Ukrainian drones tore upward from Khan, engines screaming just loud enough to be noticed, climb angles sharp and identical, movements deliberate rather than cautious. This was not a stealth launch. It was a provocation by design. Target lay deep in Crimea, an oil storage complex feeding Russian air power, and the Ukrainians knew exactly which eyes would snap open the instant those drones left the ground. Across the water, opposite Kherson, a Zoopark counter-battery radar waited, a machine built to catch artillery in the act, to translate motion into certainty. The planners wanted that radar to see everything. They wanted alarms. They wanted fear. The deception did not begin after detection. It began with detection itself, with the opening seconds shaped to look unmistakably like something far worse than 5 small drones. The radar reacted instantly, lighting up the command post with cascading alerts as 5 heat signatures climbed through 50 meters of altitude. The operator barely had time to breathe before the data flooded in. Initial velocity near 180 meters per second, climb angle close to 45 degrees, acceleration curve screaming rocket motors. This was textbook. 3 radar pings were enough. 100 meters gave position, 300 meters locked velocity, 500 meters sealed the trajectory. The ballistic computer did what it had done flawlessly for decades, applying equations that had guided artillery fire since before this war began. Upward thrust, predictable arc, inevitable descent. The solution appeared without hesitation. 5 precision rockets inbound toward Chaplinka. Impact in under a minute. The system cross-referenced profiles and found a perfect match. Simultaneous launches, steep climb, exact velocities associated with HIMARS strikes. To the operator, this was not a guess. It was certainty, and certainty is dangerous. His heart rate spiked as he reached for the encrypted phone, pushing warnings through multiple command networks while the countdown ticked down on his screen. HIMARS meant devastation. Ammunition dumps erased. Command posts vaporized. Fuel depots turned into firestorms. 40 seconds, 30, 20, 10, 0. Then nothing. No impacts, no explosions, just 5 tracks terminating in empty air 8 kilometers south of the launch site. The radar continued sweeping, stubbornly searching for targets that had simply ceased to exist. Confusion slammed into him harder than the initial alarm. Rockets did not disappear. Physics did not blink. And then the truth cut through the noise. Those targets had never been rockets at all. They had climbed just high enough to be classified as ballistic, then deliberately dropped beneath the radar horizon, plunging into the blind zone created by waves and clutter over open water. The Zoopark could see almost anything above 30 meters over land. Over the sea, it was half blind. The Ukrainians had turned its own assumptions into a weapon. He switched modes in a rush, abandoning ballistic certainty for cruise tracking, expanding parameters meant for aircraft and missiles that could think and maneuver. But time had already been lost. The drones were gone, stealing kilometers while the system waited for impacts that would never come. Updated data showed them racing low at roughly 150 kilometers per hour, heading southwest, hugging the surface so tightly that spray likely kissed their fuselages. Maritime radar stations were alerted, fragments of the deception hurriedly explained, and one finally caught them far out over the water. 5 faint contacts, altitude fluctuating between 20 and 40 meters, loose formation, almost mocking in their confidence. Identification became a nightmare. No Russian drones were scheduled in the sector, but schedules meant little in this war. Special units launched without notice. Captured platforms blurred ownership. The drones were radio silent, either fully autonomous or leaping frequencies faster than passive receivers could track. With no emissions and no visuals, the operator did what doctrine allowed. Unknown, probable hostile, confidence barely over half. The track was forwarded to Belbek with a request that carried urgency but no clarity. At 0518 hours, a Su-30 pilot received the vector through his encrypted data link. 5 slow-moving contacts, low altitude, investigate and report. He turned west, throttles forward, chasing shapes that refused to behave like proper targets. His radar, capable of spotting bombers at extreme range, struggled against objects smaller than its expectations. Composite materials drank in radar energy, turning returns into flickering ghosts. Infrared search offered nothing. The drones ran barely warmer than the sea, their heat signatures lost in residual warmth from the previous day. Electronic sensors heard only silence. These machines were disciplined, quiet, and infuriatingly hard to classify. Only when he closed dangerously near did his eyes finally catch them. Dark specks smeared across the pale water, 5 shapes spread wide and moving with purpose. Now came the most lethal moment of uncertainty. He had seconds to decide whether these were friendly assets or hostile intruders. Seconds stretched thin by a closure rate that punished hesitation. Interrogation pulses went unanswered. Light profiles matched too many platforms to matter. Visual confirmation demanded a pass so close it bordered on reckless. Missiles were the wrong tools, designed for hotter, larger prey. The cannon required precision at knife fight range, allowing exactly one attempt before overshooting. Ground control hesitated, rechecking databases, calling units that did not answer fast enough. Each second of delay carried the drones closer to whatever they were hunting. When permission finally came to close for visual identification with weapons held, the pilot descended, fuel burning fast, unaware that a far deadlier chain reaction had already begun forming around him, built on assumptions, delays, and a deception that was about to tear through the entire air defense network. The chaos on Russian frequencies rolled outward like shockwaves while the drones slipped through the seams it created. At Gvardiskoye Depot, a Pantsir crew listened to the shouting bleed through shared channels, piecing together fragments of disaster without context. A fighter downed by friendly fire, search and rescue scrambling, unknown contacts still unresolved. Every instinct told them this was the prelude, not the climax. Yet their radar showed nothing but an empty horizon, a clean sweep that suggested safety where none existed. The Pantsir's sensors were formidable within their envelope, but physics still ruled the edges. Low, slow targets hugging the surface could remain unseen until the last possible moment. The first warning did not come from a screen. It came from a human voice. A perimeter guard reported a low hum from the west, an unnatural sound growing louder with every second, vibrating through the morning air like an approaching storm held just above the ground. The radar finally caught them. It was almost too late. 5 contacts punched upward through 100 meters of altitude at 7 kilometers range, less than 3 minutes from impact. Training took over as adrenaline erased doubt. The operator slammed the system into full combat mode, fingers flying as the vehicle's sensors, missiles, and cannons snapped away. Pantsir was designed to be the last shield, a brutal, close-range defender meant to kill what slipped through everything else. Search radar, tracking radar, guided missiles, twin cannons, all bound into one platform. But even this system had limits, and those limits were about to be exploited with surgical cruelty. The fire control computer could guide only 4 missiles at once. 5 drones were inbound. There would be no perfect solution, only damage control measured in seconds. 2 missiles streaked skyward toward the leading drones, accelerating hard, pulling punishing G-forces as they curved into their intercepts. Proximity fuses detonated exactly as designed, shredding 2 FP-2 drones into spinning debris that scattered into the air. For a heartbeat, it looked like enough. Then reality reasserted itself. 3 drones remained, and they did not hesitate. Their flight profiles shifted instantly into terminal attack mode, computers taking over with cold precision. Through onboard cameras, the depot resolved into sharp geometry. Rows of white fuel tanks radiating stored heat into the cool morning air, each one a potential inferno. Target selection algorithms did not care about spectacle. They cared about effect. 1 tank upwind to spread fire, 1 holding aviation fuel to maximize volatility, 1 anchoring the northern edge to cripple the entire facility. The Pantsir's cannons opened up, twin streams of tungsten slamming into the sky at a combined rate of thousands of rounds per minute. The gunner tracked the nearest drone through his sight, watching rounds spark and tear chunks from its composite skin. Control surfaces shredded, wings fractured. But the warhead held, armored and intact, built to survive exactly this kind of punishment. The damaged drone lost stability, spiraling wildly, slamming into the ground near another tank in a violent blast that shattered windows and sent shockwaves rolling across the depot. Alarms wailed, fires bloomed, and still 2 drones remained, diving now at brutal angles that pushed the system beyond its mechanical limits. The cannons could not elevate fast enough. By the time the barrels climbed, the drones had already fallen through the engagement envelope. At 100 meters altitude, both FP-2s cut their engines and went silent. No heat, no noise, just mass and gravity. They dropped like stones, unpowered, unstoppable. The first impact punched straight through thin steel into the vapor space of a fuel tank, detonating where fumes and air mixed in the most destructive ratio imaginable. The tank did not explode outward. It ruptured, seams tearing open as thousands of cubic meters of fuel erupted into a rolling fireball that flattened everything nearby. Seconds later, the second drone struck its target, aviation fuel igniting in a blinding flash that sent a thermal pulse racing across the depot, lighting off secondary fires before anyone could react. Within hours, the facility was effectively erased. Tanks collapsed, others burned uncontrollably, black smoke clawing into the sky for days. The damage rippled outward with merciless efficiency. Fighter bases that depended on that fuel found themselves grounded, aircraft intact but useless, engines silent not from enemy fire but from empty lines. The drones had achieved something missiles rarely could. They had not just destroyed hardware, they had strangled capability. And as the fires burned, the deeper truth settled in across command rooms and radar sites alike. The most dangerous part of the attack had not been the explosion. It had been the deception that turned defenders against themselves, opening the door just wide enough for 5 small machines to walk through and rewrite the balance of the fight. The aftermath unfolded in layers, each one more unsettling than the last, not because of what burned, but because of what failed. As daylight fully broke over Crimea, commanders stared at maps that no longer made sense. Air defense zones overlapped perfectly on paper, yet 5 drones had threaded through them with almost contemptuous ease. The network had not been overwhelmed by numbers. It had been dismantled by logic turned against itself. Every system had behaved correctly in isolation. The radar detected, the fighter investigated, the missile battery followed doctrine, the point defense engaged. And yet the sum of those correct actions produced catastrophe. A modern fighter lost to its own defenses, a fuel depot erased, air power crippled without a single runway cratered. This was not brute force warfare, it was cognitive warfare, engineered to induce hesitation, misclassification, and internal conflict at precisely the wrong moments. Investigators would later reconstruct the sequence frame by frame, data point by data point, searching for a single error to blame. They would find none large enough to explain the outcome. The deception began with launch geometry, exploiting ballistic assumptions embedded deep inside radar software. It continued with altitude management, using the physics of radar horizons to vanish at will. It matured with silence, denying electronic intelligence the clues it depended on. It climaxed with timing, forcing human operators to make binary decisions under impossible ambiguity. The friendly fire incident was not an accident in the traditional sense. It was an induced condition, a predictable outcome of stress, incomplete information, and doctrine optimized for a cleaner battlefield that no longer existed. On the ground, the loss of the fuel depot rippled outward into operational paralysis. Aircraft sat fueled by paperwork rather than kerosene. Sortie rates collapsed without a shot fired at the runways themselves. Maintenance crews worked on machines that could not fly. Pilots trained for missions that were quietly canceled. The drones had not needed to destroy airframes to neutralize air power. They had severed the artery instead. Even days later, smoke still marked the location, a visual reminder visible from miles away, impossible to hide from satellites or from morale. Every plume told the same story. The defenses had been present, they had been active, and they had been outplayed. What lingered most was the psychological damage. Operators who had trusted their screens now questioned them. Pilots hesitated, knowing identification errors could be fatal from either side. Air defense crews became more cautious, slower to engage, haunted by the knowledge that one wrong classification could repeat the disaster. That hesitation was itself a secondary effect of the strike, another invisible payload delivered without explosives. The drones were long gone, but their influence persisted, embedded in procedures, in briefings, in the pauses between decisions. The battlefield had shifted again, away from sheer detection and interception, toward perception, assumption, and the exploitation of human-machine trust. By the time analysts fully grasped what had happened, the lesson was already clear and deeply uncomfortable. Advanced systems did not fail because they were outdated. They failed because they were predictable. The drones had not been faster, stronger, or louder. They had been smarter in how they appeared, how they disappeared, and how they forced defenders to act against their own interests. In a war increasingly defined by autonomy and algorithmic decision-making, the strike exposed a truth that could not be easily erased. The most devastating weapon was not the one that hit hardest, but the one that convinced the enemy to open the door themselves. The reverberations did not stop at the scorched perimeter of the depot. Inside command rooms, the incident metastasized into something far more corrosive than physical loss. Every replay of radar data sharpened the same uncomfortable conclusion. The systems had been manipulated, not overwhelmed. The drones had never needed to defeat Russian air defense head-on. They had redirected it inward. Each decision point had been nudged just enough to push operators toward the most damaging option available at that moment. Confidence in automation collided with fear of hesitation, and the result was a cascade no individual could stop once it began. This was the real strike. The explosions were simply the punctuation at the end of a sentence written much earlier, when the first radar assumed it was seeing rockets instead of machines capable of lying. Across Crimea, air defense crews adjusted their behavior in ways that never made official reports. Radar operators lingered longer before classifying tracks. Engagement officers demanded extra confirmations that slowed reaction times by precious seconds. Fighter pilots questioned vectors, double-checked identification codes, and flew with an awareness that friendly fire was no longer a theoretical risk. These micro-delays accumulated into systemic friction, the kind no software patch could fix overnight. The drones had not only destroyed fuel, they had injected doubt into a network that depended on speed and certainty. Every hesitation became another invisible success for the attackers, long after the last fire had burned itself down to ash. The strike also forced a quiet reckoning with scale. Multi-million-dollar interceptors had been launched against targets costing a fraction of that price. A state-of-the-art fighter had been lost not to enemy missiles, but to its own defensive architecture. Analysts could dress it up with technical language, but the imbalance was impossible to ignore. Cheap, expendable platforms had coerced the use of the most expensive assets on the board, then slipped past while those assets destroyed each other. This was not attrition warfare. It was economic warfare executed in the air, where the cost curve itself became a weapon, bending outcomes without ever appearing on the battlefield. Even the surviving defenses learned the wrong lessons first. Some units pushed for more aggressive engagement rules, others for stricter identification requirements. Both approaches carried risk. Shoot faster, and friendly fire incidents multiply. Wait longer, and drones slip through again. The attack had deliberately forced this dilemma, trapping defenders between speed and safety with no clean escape. That tension lingered in every subsequent alert, every unknown track, every low-altitude contact skimming the edge of the radar horizon. Long after the smoke columns thinned and the wreckage cooled, the deeper meaning of the strike continued to spread through military planning circles. It demonstrated that dominance was no longer guaranteed by superior sensors or heavier missiles alone. Dominance now depended on how well a force understood the assumptions baked into its own machines, and how easily those assumptions could be turned inside out. The drones had not broken the system. They had simply asked it the wrong question and let it answer itself into disaster. In that sense, the most aggressive aspect of the operation was not the fire or the destruction, but the precision with which it exposed vulnerability where confidence had once lived. The final phase unfolded with brutal speed once the first tank ruptured, turning the depot into a maze of pressure waves and cascading fires. Shock fronts slammed into adjacent structures, metal screaming as seams failed, and valves tore free under forces they were never meant to endure. Burning fuel spilled into containment trenches already overwhelmed, flames racing along channels like liquid fury seeking new oxygen. Secondary detonations popped in rapid succession as safety systems failed in sequence, each blast feeding the next. Fire crews never had a chance to form lines. The heat was immediate and absolute, flattening decision windows to zero. Vehicles abandoned mid-maneuver melted into the asphalt, tires collapsing as if punctured by invisible hands. Overhead, the air shimmered, distorting vision and instruments alike, turning the entire complex into a single violent organism consuming itself. Inside the Panzer vehicle, alarms stacked faster than they could be acknowledged. The operator attempted a re-engagement that never materialized, slewing sensors toward ghosts that no longer existed, while the battlefield collapsed around him. Radio traffic devolved into fragmented shouting as units reported fires, structural failures, and loss of control. Orders overlapped, contradicted, then dissolved under the roar. The crew could feel the concussive force through the hull as another tank vented violently, a towering column of flame punching upward and then folding outward, rolling across the depot in a suffocating wave. Visibility dropped to nothing. Smoke swallowed landmarks. Orientation vanished. The system designed to be the final shield was now blind, deaf, and irrelevant, trapped inside the damage it could not prevent. Above the chaos, there was no enemy aircraft to chase, no missiles to intercept, no targets left to engage. The attack had already ended, even as destruction accelerated. The drones were gone, their job complete, leaving behind only momentum. Fuel lines ruptured under sustained heat, feeding fires that refused to die. Emergency shutoffs failed as power was lost. Each minute without control multiplied the damage geometrically. Attempts to isolate sections of the depot collapsed when access roads became impassable, blocked by wreckage and fire. What had been a logistical backbone hours earlier was now an expanding exclusion zone, too dangerous to approach, too critical to abandon. As the fires climbed higher, visible for kilometers, the reality of the strike locked in with brutal clarity. No follow-on wave arrived, none was needed. The action had already achieved its maximum effect. Aircraft sat idle on distant runways, pilots watching smoke columns rise while maintenance crews confirmed the obvious. Fuel would not be coming. Sorties were canceled not by enemy fire, but by absence. In the space of minutes, 5 small machines had converted motion into paralysis, speed into confusion, and defense into self-inflicted damage. The battlefield fell silent not because the fight was over, but because there was nothing left to stop and nothing left to launch. At 0617 local time, a Ukrainian Barracuda drone boat slipped into the Dnepro River outside Kherson and turned its bow toward a Russian small boat forward operating base stacked with fuel drums, ammunition crates, and canned engine parts. The plan looked simple on a map. Stay low, stay quiet, sprint the last stretch, and let a shaped charge do the rest. But the first danger was not Russian fire. It was a Ukrainian machine gun position 500 feet upriver, watching the same water corridor through night vision and trained to shoot anything that moved. The Barracuda cleared the last reeds on the Ukrainian bank, entered open water, and instantly lit up as a warm streak against the colder river surface. Downstream, the gunner swung his barrel toward the heat bloom and steadied for a decision that had to be made in seconds. In a hardened bunker 14 miles away, the Barracuda operator froze his controls and let the boat drift on momentum alone because a single wrong input could look like evasive movement. Overhead, a Ukrainian FPV quadcopter circled at 1,000 feet, broadcasting a coded friendly signal while the gunner raised his goggles, searching for the one detail that would keep him from pulling the trigger. 5 seconds passed like a full minute, then 7. The gunner's view tightened on the hull, and he saw it. A pulsing infrared strobe mounted low on the Barracuda's side, blinking a pattern only Ukrainian forces would recognize from their watch turnover briefs. For a brief stretch of time, nothing moved. The gunner watched for the correct corridor lane, the correct strobe code, and the correct behavior, because in this river war, the last check is how a vessel acts under scrutiny. The Barracuda stayed slow and straight at 8 knots, leaving a flat, controlled wake that looked deliberate instead of evasive. That mattered as much as the strobe. Russian sabotage boats tend to sprint and zigzag because they expect to be shot. Ukrainian drone boats move like they belong there because predictability matches the briefing. The gunner lowered his weapon without breaking radio silence, without a spotlight, without a shouted warning that could expose his position. The Barracuda slid past, surviving a threat that repeats night after night on this front. Friendly forces forced to judge a bright heat signature with only a few seconds of evidence. Up close, it is easy to understand why the Barracuda can be mistaken for an enemy craft. The hull is 18 feet of fiberglass composite, light enough to plane fast, tough enough to absorb small arms impacts without catastrophic failure, and low enough that it rides just 16 inches above the waterline on a modified deep V shape that cuts river chop while keeping radar cross-section small. Propulsion comes from a single 20-watt brushless electric motor fed by lithium batteries, giving roughly 4 hours of endurance at patrol speed. At 8 knots, the motor is nearly silent. You will not hear it until it is inside 200 feet, and by then, it is already past the point where a shouted challenge helps. At full sprint, the same system can push the boat to 38 knots, fast enough to outrun any manned vessel the Russians typically operate on the Dnepro. In the bow sits a 35-kilogram shaped charge warhead, built to rupture thin-walled targets and turn a fuel stack into a pressure-driven fire. If the control link fails completely, an onboard GPS autopilot can execute a final waypoint attack without human input. The Russians are not just facing remote control, They are facing a boat that can finish alone. That is why Ukrainian outposts receive corridor briefings at every watch change, down to the lane, the time window, and the identification signal. On the Barracuda's deck, the infrared beacon is small, about the size of a hockey puck, invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable through night vision when it pulses the correct pattern. It lets a gunner confirm hold fire without speaking, and it keeps a mission alive without asking a soldier at the water's edge to gamble. But the strobe is only part of the system. The Barracuda moved slowly through the friendly zone because behavior is the final confirmation, and because at low speed it buys time if something goes wrong with command and control. The moment it cleared the last checkpoint and entered the transition channel, the operator pushed to 14 knots, and the escort drone climbed to around 1,300 feet to widen its view. That is when the operator's screen flickered. A frame froze, stuttered, then jumped forward. The interference was not Russian, it was Ukrainian, and it was about to become the most dangerous obstacle on the route. Every night, Ukrainian electronic warfare units flood the river corridor with radio noise meant to disable Russian drones before they reach friendly positions, and the jamming does not distinguish between enemy links and friendly ones. The front line is so saturated with drones that neither side leaves clean electromagnetic lanes for long, because a single accidental gap can become a highway for hostile systems. The Barracuda does not receive commands directly from the bunker because the distance is too far and the terrain is too cluttered. Radio travels in straight lines, but the Dnepro riverbank is a maze of reeds, sandbars, and flooded forest that blocks, scatters, and absorbs transmissions. A direct link would fade within a few miles, so Ukraine uses a relay chain. Commands travel through a fiber optic cable to a hidden transmitter site 8 miles behind the front. Then, a tightly focused radio beam only a few degrees wide punches up to the drone overhead, and the drone rebroadcasts down to the boat at close range. The escort is a heavily modified DJI Matrice 300 turned into a battlefield relay station with a directional antenna array, a 15-watt repeater, and a thermal imager refreshing at 60 frames per second. But the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and the Barracuda's antenna sits just 10 inches above the waterline, where reflections and reeds turn clean signals into overlapping echoes. Latency jumped from 1/10 of a second toward 1/2 a second. The boat drifted a few degrees off course, and the operator realized that if the relay did not recover fast, the flooded forest ahead would not just hide the Barracuda from Russian eyes. It would hide the Barracuda from its own controller. The FPV pilot reacted before the delay could compound. He climbed another 200 feet and slid east by roughly the same distance, pulling the relay path above the worst of the friendly jamming and recentering the transmitter beam. The effect was immediate. Latency collapsed back toward 1/10 of a second. The video feed snapped into focus, and the operator corrected the Barracuda's heading with 2 precise rudder taps. For a moment, the system breathed again, but the river ahead was no longer a simple corridor. The transition channel narrowed and bent into a wetland labyrinth where flooded forest replaced open water. Reed walls rose 15 feet on both sides, blocking ambient light and turning the nose camera into a useless wash of dark shapes. From this point on, the operator stopped trusting the forward view entirely and flew by the overhead thermal picture, watching the Barracuda's white silhouette creep through a maze of vegetation, sandbars, and half-submerged debris that would be invisible from water level. This was where the escort drone earned its payload. The Matrice's thermal imager, running at 640 by 512 resolution with a 60 Hz refresh rate, could separate a submerged log from a sandbar by temperature alone. Waterlogged wood holds heat longer than river silt, and in passages this tight, 1/2 a second of delay is the difference between threading a gap and burying the bow. The Barracuda slowed to 6 knots, just fast enough to maintain steerage, but slow enough to stop before colliding with something the FPV pilot spotted at the last moment. Speed is the enemy in a flooded forest. At 20 knots, a hidden log can flip the hull or snap a propeller shaft. A sandbar can grab fiberglass and end a mission without a shot fired. The operator nudged the rudder as a faint white shape slid past the port side on thermal, a rusted barge hull half sunk and invisible from the boat's perspective. A few degrees either way, and the composite skin would have scraped metal. For 200 feet, the channel narrowed until the passage was barely 10 feet wide. Reeds brushing both sides as the Barracuda's wake rippled against vegetation. The FPV pilot called corrections in single-word bursts, left steady, right steady, while the operator held his breath and kept inputs minimal to avoid overcorrecting through latency. When the reeds finally opened, the boat emerged into a wider channel with real current and room to maneuver. The relief lasted less than a second because the geometry had just shifted in the worst possible way. Inside the flooded forest, the tall reed walls blocked line of sight from everything, including Russian observation drones. Out here, the channel stretched hundreds of feet wide with low banks, and the Barracuda's heat bloom was now visible from half a mile in any direction. On the thermal display, the FPV pilot saw it first, a faint white speck moving laterally 2,000 feet to the northeast. Then another circling above the opposite bank in a slow patrol orbit. They were not alone, and the Russians were already hunting. The lateral speck stopped circling and dove. A Russian FPV attack drone dropped from 600 feet and accelerated straight toward the Barracuda's last known position. At typical attack speeds, the operator had under 10 seconds before impact. Reduce throttle, drift to the reeds, now. The command came sharp and immediate. The operator cut power completely and let momentum carry the hull toward a dense reed cluster on the right bank. Without the motor, the thermal signature began to cool, the bright streak fading into a warmer patch among dozens of debris piles and mud banks. The Barracuda slid under overhanging stalks and stopped, hidden beneath vegetation. The Russian FPV screamed overhead at low altitude, its camera hunting for a target that no longer looked distinct enough to justify a strike. It circled once, twice, then climbed back toward patrol height. Without a clean lock, the pilot did not waste his drone on a guess, but the danger was not over. A second Russian FP5 was already repositioning, and this one knew roughly where to look. The operator keyed his radio through the relay and sent a short request with a grid reference and bearing, asking for immediate suppression. 14 miles behind the line, a Ukrainian electronic warfare vehicle was already tracking hostile drone activity along the river. The truck carried multiple antenna panels mounted on a rotating turret, phased arrays capable of focusing jamming energy into a narrow cone and steering it at specific sectors. Unlike older systems that flood the entire spectrum and blind friendly links as easily as enemy ones, this platform analyzed hostile signal characteristics in real time and generated targeted interference aimed only at those frequencies. It covered the bands Russian FP5 drones rely on while leaving Ukrainian relay paths intact because they were operating elsewhere. The turret rotated, the panels aligned on, and the system pushed focused electromagnetic energy toward bearing 045. On the FPV pilot's thermal display, the first Russian drone wobbled, control inputs turning sluggish as the interference overwhelmed its receiver. On the FPV pilot's thermal display, the first Russian drone wobbled, control inputs turning sluggish as the interference overwhelmed its receiver. Seconds later, it nosed over and dropped into the river. The second drone tried to climb out of the cone, but the beam followed and it spiraled down into the reeds a few hundred feet from the Barracuda's hiding place. The operator waited, counting slowly, scanning the thermal feed for any additional movement. Nothing shifted. He brought the throttle back up gently, eased the Barracuda out of the reeds, and resumed course toward the final passage. Across several hundred feet of open water sat the target, a cluster of Russian outboard boats, fuel drums stacked on wooden pallets, and makeshift supply shelters glowing white-hot on thermal. The sprint was coming, but the moment the Barracuda entered open water again, the Russians answered with electronic warfare of their own, and this time they aimed at the relay itself. The operator's screen disintegrated into blocky pixels and frozen frames, latency spiking toward half a second as throttle commands queued instead of executing. The boat's heading drifted toward a reed bank, and the operator could not correct fast enough to stop it. This was Russian jamming, coming from a vehicle-mounted system on the bank that flooded the corridor with interference. At water level, geometry made it brutal. The FPV overhead still heard the bunker clearly because it had altitude, but the final link from the drone down to the boat was collapsing, severing the chain at its weakest point. The FPV pilot did not wait for instructions. He climbed hard, pushing above the altitude where the Russian jammer focused its energy, then slid laterally to find a steep angle where signal strength dropped. For several seconds, the operator flew blind, steering by watching the Barracuda's white silhouette drift across the overhead thermal view and guessing where his inputs would land after delay. Every correction was an estimate, every second a risk. Then the relay punched through. Latency fell back toward a tenth of a second, the picture sharpened, and the operator snapped the heading back online with 3 quick rudder pulses. The jamming zone was behind them. The target was now less than 1,000 feet ahead. The sprint began the moment the Barracuda cleared the edge of the jamming zone. The operator pushed the throttle to maximum, and the electric motor surged, lifting the hull onto plane and driving it forward at 38 knots. On the overhead thermal feed, the wake flared white as the boat covered 100 feet in just over a second. Russian personnel on the riverbank reacted late. Some moved for cover, others reached for rifles, but none had time to organize a response. At this speed, the engagement window collapsed. By the time the first weapon came up, the Barracuda was already inside effective range. Steering precision no longer mattered. The operator locked the rudder toward the densest cluster of fuel drums and moored boats and committed to impact. At 40 feet, the forward camera washed out beneath the thermal glare of heated metal and stacked fuel containers. The operator released the controls and let physics take over. The Barracuda's shaped charge detonated the instant the hull made contact, channeling explosive force outward and downward in a focused wave. Boats, pallets, and shelters were struck simultaneously, leaving no time for secondary reactions. One outboard boat was lifted completely out of the water and shattered as it slammed back down. Fuel drums ruptured a fraction of a second later, erupting into a vertical column of fire that towered over the riverbank. The blast collapsed multiple supply shelters and hurled ammunition crates deep into the reeds. High above, the FPV relay drone jolted as the shockwave reached altitude, then stabilized and continued recording every moment of the strike. Secondary explosions followed in rapid sequence as pooled fuel ignited and ammunition cooked off inside the shattered debris. A heavier detonation inside a collapsed shelter punched another bright flash into the fire, briefly overpowering everything else on the thermal display. Burning wreckage spread across the shallow water, merging into a continuous thermal bloom that lit up the inlet and made concealment impossible. The heat signature expanded well beyond the riverbanks, visible to any sensor in the area. Russian personnel broke contact and withdrew inland, abandoning the site without attempting recovery. The FPV drone held position overhead, its thermal feed confirming complete destruction and lingering long enough to ensure that nothing functional remained. As the fire settled into sustained burns, the operator held the feed and let the tension drain from his hands. The Barracuda no longer existed as a controllable platform, but it had completed its task without a single Ukrainian soldier exposed on the water. The relay drone's remaining endurance now dictated the next move. It widened its orbit, confirmed no surviving activity, then turned back along a low-altitude route chosen to stay beneath long-range detection thresholds. Russian electronic warfare systems continued probing the corridor for several moments, searching for signals that no longer existed. One by one, the relay links went dark as the ground transmitter powered down, leaving only burning wreckage and empty spectrum behind. The operational impact was immediate and impossible to ignore. The destroyed site was not merely equipment storage, but a forward logistics node that enabled repeated small boat operations along the river. Fuel drums, spare engines, and ammunition staged at the water's edge allowed sustained activity without exposing larger rear depots. With that node erased, routes were forced to stretch, transit times increased, and every replacement effort became visible and vulnerable. Rebuilding demanded daylight movement, heavy transport, and predictable patterns that could be observed, tracked, and struck. The true damage extended far beyond what burned on the riverbank and lingered long after the thermal signatures faded. The Barracuda's run demonstrated a combat system operating under constant pressure and progressive degradation. Friendly identification procedures prevented fratricide in a corridor where seconds decide outcomes. A layered relay chain overcame terrain, distance, and signal loss that would have ended a conventional remote operation. Electronic warfare countermeasures adapted in real time as the electromagnetic environment shifted from friendly jamming to hostile suppression without warning. Autonomous fail-safes stood ready to complete the strike even if every control link collapsed. The mission succeeded not because conditions were favorable, but because the system was engineered to survive confusion, interference, and failure long enough to deliver a decisive result. In the hours that followed, Russian river traffic along this sector dropped sharply. Patrol routes shifted away from the destroyed inlet, and small craft that normally staged forward were pulled back to less exposed positions. That adjustment carried a cost. Longer transit distances increased fuel consumption, reduced time on station, and narrowed the window for night operations. Every additional mile forced crews to choose between speed and concealment, and every choice created a new pattern for Ukrainian surveillance to track. The absence of one logistics point reshaped behavior across the entire stretch of river. What makes this strike difficult to counter is not the individual platform, but the architecture behind it. Removing the drone boat does not remove the relay, the electronic warfare shield, or the identification system that kept it alive long enough to reach the target. Each element can be replaced independently and upgraded without changing the rest. That modularity shortens recovery time and complicates Russian planning. The next Barracuda will not need the same route, the same frequencies, or the same timing. It will only need the same few seconds of access. At 0600 hours local time, the MiG-29 sat silent inside its concrete revetment at Kachcha Airfield in Crimea. Its engines cold, its pilot asleep a short walk away, unaware that the aircraft's hunting days were already over. For weeks, this jet had prowled low-altitude corridors above the Black Sea, intercepting Ukrainian reconnaissance drones, calling coordinates to air defense batteries, and building a reputation as a reliable predator in Russian airspace control. Tonight, there would be no scramble order, no warning tone, and no chance to climb. 400 kilometers away, long before dawn reached the coast, a weapon was already in the air on a trajectory designed to make sure this fighter never flew again. The Russians did not know it yet, but the clock had already started counting down toward a result they could no longer influence. At the same moment, the MiG rested in darkness. A pneumatic catapult fired west of Croissant, hurling a UJ-26 Beaver drone off its launch rail with a sharp mechanical crack that vanished into the wind. Its rear-mounted propeller caught immediately, pulling the composite airframe upward to 60 meters before leveling into cruise. The sound signature dropped almost instantly, quiet enough that a soldier standing 500 meters away would hear nothing but grass moving in the breeze. 3 Ukrainian special operations soldiers had less than 2 minutes to disappear. They folded the launch rail in 12 seconds, buried thermal blankets under gear in the truck bed, and rolled away along a dirt track parallel to an irrigation channel. The Beaver was already 2 kilometers downrange, accelerating toward a destination 398 kilometers southeast. 14 miles east, a Pol 21 electronic warfare tower registered an anomaly almost the instant the drone powered on. Passive receivers blanketing the corridor were tuned to detect satellite navigation signals, and the Beaver's encrypted handshake produced a brief frequency-hopping burst in the L-band. It lasted only 4 milliseconds, barely enough to raise the noise floor, but enough for a duty officer with Rubicon, Russia's dedicated drone hunting unit, to flag it as suspicious. A possible long-range launch, general coordinates in the Kherson sector. Within minutes, an Orlan 30 surveillance drone lifted from a nearby site and began sweeping thermal imagery across fields and roads, searching for the fading heat of a vehicle that could not have gone far. Watching the Beaver climb through 400 meters explains why Rubicon prioritizes killing operators instead of chasing drones. The airframe measures roughly 2.5 meters from nose to tail. Fiberglass composite stretched over a canard configuration with small forward wings for pitch control and a swept main wing for lift. A rear-mounted propeller pushes it at 160 kilometers per hour, while composite construction produces a radar cross-section between 0.01 and 0.03 square meters, smaller than most birds. At night, flying low over terrain clutter, the drone is nearly invisible to Russian air defense. The people who launched it are not. Rubicon understands that trained crews take months to build, months of learning emission discipline and autonomous navigation under pressure. Eliminate them, and Ukraine loses something far more valuable than a single drone. The Orlan's thermal camera operated in the 3 to 5 micron band, sensitive enough to detect a vehicle engine that shut down 20 minutes earlier. Residual heat decays at roughly 2 degrees Celsius per minute, leaving a detectable signature for another quarter hour. The Ukrainians knew this. They pulled into a collapsed barn, shut down the engine, and draped thermal blankets across the hood and roof. For 8 minutes, they sat motionless in absolute silence while the Orlan passed overhead. On its display, a ghost image flickered where the truck had idled, compressed grass still warm beneath the tires. The operator vectored toward the anomaly, prompting Rubicon to dispatch 2 FPV hunter teams carrying lightweight drones designed to saturate search sectors and force mistakes. Each FPV weighed less than a kilogram, flew at 120 kilometers per hour, and carried a fragmentation charge capable of destroying a vehicle engine. Their advantage was numbers. A single team carried 6 to 8 drones, enough to blanket likely escape routes while flying 10 to 15 meters above ground, where thermal signatures blended into clutter and acoustic noise stayed below ambient levels until the last seconds. Russian doctrine assumed operators would flee fast after launch. The Ukrainians did neither. They stayed hidden as an FPV passed 400 meters east, its camera sweeping past the barn's collapsed roof without pausing. 50 kilometers away, the Beaver climbed toward its 800-meter cruise altitude and entered complete silence. No uplink, no telemetry, no emissions of any kind, trusting its navigation system to carry it onward while its operators focused only on staying alive. At 0616 hours, the Orlan passed directly over the barn and registered nothing but ambient temperature. No vehicle, no personnel, no target. Rubicon logged the search as inconclusive and escalated the hunt outward. The Beaver crossed the Dnipro River 19 minutes later, flying southeast toward Crimea on a heading that would take it over more than 200 kilometers of open steppe. There was no terrain masking here, no cloud cover, just a composite airframe the size of a dining table moving through radar coverage that extended hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Yet Russian air defense networks saw almost nothing. Radar detection depends on wavelength, target size, and aspect angle, and the Beaver's skin absorbed and scattered energy instead of reflecting it. At grazing angles, when beams struck from below at shallow incidents, returns dropped to near zero. Russian S-band search radars could theoretically detect a target with a radar cross-section of 0.03 square meters at 40 to 50 kilometers, but only if geometry was perfect. The Beaver's flight path had been calculated specifically to avoid those conditions. It flew on inertial navigation, its GPS receiver active but silent, tracking acceleration and rotation through gyroscopes and accelerometers. Dead reckoning introduced drift, roughly 30 to 40 meters per minute without correction, but over a 400-kilometer flight, the accumulated error remained under a kilometer. That margin was acceptable because terminal guidance would allow correction later, assuming contact could be safely re-established. Back at Rubicon's operations center, analysts began reverse vector reconstruction, plotting fleeting radar paints into a backward cone pointing toward the probable launch area. The Beaver had been briefly detected twice, once by a Crimean early warning radar and once by a mobile S-300 acquisition unit. Each contact lasted less than 2 seconds, insufficient for engagement but enough to establish bearings. The cone narrowed to a 20-kilometer corridor centered on the launch sector. A second wave of Orlan drones lifted, and FPV teams repositioned to cover bridges and canal crossings. Somewhere inside that corridor, 3 Ukrainians waited in silence, knowing they could not warn the drone without revealing themselves. At 0700 hours, the Beaver's flight computer registered a navigation anomaly. Satellite signal strength dropped from 5 to 3, then flickered to 2. Position accuracy degraded from sub-meter precision to a 50-meter error circle that jumped unpredictably. Russian electronic warfare had found the approach corridor. ZTOL jamming systems mounted on trucks along likely UAV routes began flooding GPS frequencies with noise. Each system used directional antennas broadcasting hundreds of watts in 60-degree cones, overlapping coverage zones to create a continuous blanket. GPS satellites transmitted weak signals from tens of thousands of kilometers away, and even modest interference could overwhelm them. The Beaver's computer switched to inertial-only mode as drift began accumulating immediately. 3 ZTOL vehicles were positioned along the Crimean approach, forcing the drone to accept increasing error with every passing minute. Over the next hour, drift would reach nearly a kilometer, recoverable, but only if operators could re-establish contact during terminal guidance. In the barn, the Ukrainian team monitored their relay status panel. The Beaver was far beyond direct radio range, and emission silence was mandatory. They could not see where it was or whether it still flew. All they could do was trust the system they had built. Meanwhile, Rubicon's FPV hunters continued sweeping the corridor, unaware that their quarry was still close. At 0714 hours, another FPV passed within 400 meters of the barn. Its thermal camera lingered briefly, then moved on. The collapsed roof created an irregular heat pattern that masked the truck inside, and the blankets had cooled to ambient temperature. Rubicon was not trying to shoot down the Beaver. Commanders understood that long-range composite drones routinely defeated short-range air defenses. Shooting one down meant little if more followed. Trained operators were the true objective. Rubicon's doctrine was simple: remove the humans and the drone program collapses with them. At 0721, confident the immediate hunt had moved on, the team restarted the truck and rolled south toward a safe house 14 kilometers away, while the Beaver closed to within 180 kilometers of Kachcha airfield. At 0759 hours, the Beaver crossed into Crimean airspace, now less than 100 kilometers from Kachcha airfield. Its onboard computer activated the optical guidance camera and began transmitting a narrow beam uplink toward a relay station hidden inside Ukrainian-controlled territory. For the first time in nearly 2 hours, the operators could see what the drone saw. The video feed was grainy and compressed to preserve bandwidth, jittering with latency that made every correction feel delayed. Through the noise, the airfield emerged as a gray smear of concrete and blast walls, slowly resolving as the drone descended. The MiG-29 sat parked in its revetment, nose protruding just enough to be visible beyond the protective walls. The operator identified the target and began issuing small steering inputs, compensating for inertial drift accumulated during jamming. What he could not see was that Rubicon detected the uplink almost instantly. Even tightly focused directional antennas produce side lobe leakage, stray radio energy spilling beyond the main transmission path. Russian signal intelligence arrays along the Crimean coast were calibrated to detect exactly the signature. Within 4 seconds, they had a bearing. Within 8, 3 stations triangulated the approximate position of the relay source to within 200 meters. From first detection to firing solution, 11 seconds elapsed. By the time the Ukrainian operator completed his first correction, Rubicon already knew where to shoot. The bearing pointed back along the same corridor Rubicon had been searching for hours, toward a bomb-damaged apartment complex far from the original launch site. Rubicon responded with everything available. FPV drones launched along the triangulated line, a Lancet loitering munition vectored toward likely vehicle routes. Artillery coordinates were sent for immediate approval. None of this was visible to the Ukrainian team. Their attention was locked entirely on the screen as the MiG grew larger in frame. Latency forced the operator to anticipate movements rather than react, adjusting for a delay measured in fractions of a second that felt like an eternity. At 0805, the first artillery shell landed 2 kilometers behind the safe house. The team froze, but the relay signal remained stable. Rubicon had their grid now, and more rounds were coming. The operator forced himself to ignore the distant impacts and focus on the approach. The Beaver was 2 kilometers from the target, 90 seconds to impact. A second shell fell closer, 1,000 meters east. The security element reported FPV drones inbound from the north, closing fast. At the same moment, the operator noticed the accumulated navigation error. Inertial drift had pushed the Beaver 340 meters left of the aim point. Without correction, it would strike empty concrete. He needed one adjustment, a 3-degree heading change requiring less than 2 seconds of transmission. He sent it. The command uploaded successfully, locking into the Beaver's flight computer. The operator continued steering as the MiG filled the frame. 60 seconds remained. Unknown to Rubicon, the relay station they were targeting was unmanned, a deliberate sacrifice positioned precisely because Russian doctrine demanded immediate destruction of any transmission source. The Ukrainian team was nowhere near the equipment Rubicon believed they were killing. On Rubicon's tactical display, bearing lines converged on the ruined apartment block. The lead FP5 dove at a steep angle, camera fixed on a rooftop antenna array. Speed mattered more than confirmation. The first drone struck dead center, its fragmentation charge detonating and collapsing the roof. The second hit seconds later, detonating inside the structure. The third ensured nothing remained intact. Artillery continued to fall, pulverizing the grid coordinate into rubble. Thermal imagery showed no movement. Rubicon logged the mission as successful. The operators had been neutralized. That assumption cost them everything. The final correction was already stored. The Beaver no longer needed guidance. Its nose remained aligned on the MiG as it entered terminal dive, descending rapidly toward a target that could no longer escape. At 0806 hours and 34 seconds, the Beaver struck the MiG-29. The 20-kilogram shaped charge detonated instantly. The pressure wave ripped through aluminum skin from nose to tail. Cockpit disintegrated. Fuel sprayed across the revetment and ignited a fraction of a second later. Flames surged skyward, secondary explosions rippling through the airframe as ammunition cooked off and hydraulic lines burst. When the fire settled, Nothing remained but a blackened skeleton of twisted metal. The explosion at Kachicha Airfield registered across multiple sensor networks within seconds. Infrared satellites detected a sudden heat bloom where the MiG had been parked, followed by a rapid drop as fuel finished burning and structural materials cooled. Russian base security scrambled, but there was nothing to secure. The revetment was a cratered shell, the fighter reduced to warped spars and melted wiring embedded in scorched concrete. Fire crews arrived to find no secondary threats, no unexploded ordnance, and no survivors to recover. Whatever investigation followed would start from the same conclusion. The aircraft had never been airborne. It had been destroyed where it slept. Inside Rubicon's operations center, confidence began to erode as reports arrived out of sequence. The relay station they believed destroyed had indeed been eliminated, but follow-on signals indicated the strike had still succeeded. Analysts replayed the last seconds of data, trying to reconcile how a supposedly unguided drone had achieved a direct hit. The three-man Ukrainian team listened to distant detonations from their basement shelter, counting the seconds until the relay went silent. When it did, they did not move. They waited, knowing that Rubicon would saturate the grid coordinate long after the target was gone. Only after thermal sensors confirmed the barrage had ended did they begin exfiltration on foot, abandoning the vehicle entirely. By then, the Beaver's mission was already complete. The drone no longer existed. Its role had ended at impact, its value fully expended in a single, irreversible moment. Russian commanders would later characterize the destruction of the MiG as an unacceptable lapse in perimeter defense, a failure of guard rotations, sensor coverage, and hardened shelter placement. That explanation was convenient because it framed the loss as a localized mistake rather than a systemic problem. But inside staff briefings, the discussion quickly moved beyond fences and patrols. The uncomfortable truth was that the aircraft had not been lost because defenses were weak at Kachicha Airfield. It had been lost because the assumptions underpinning those defenses no longer matched the reality of modern long-range strike warfare. The perimeter had worked exactly as designed against threats it understood. The attack simply did not belong to that category anymore. The operation demonstrated with brutal clarity that long-range, one-way drones did not require persistent control to be effective. Continuous uplinks, once considered essential for precision, had become optional rather than mandatory. The Beaver tolerated navigation drift measured in hundreds of meters, survived prolonged GPS denial, and still achieved a lethal hit using a terminal guidance window measured in seconds. This was not an accident or luck. It was the result of deliberate design choices that accepted imperfection in exchange for reach. Russian planners had built their counter-drone doctrine around the idea that breaking control links meant neutralizing the threat. That belief no longer held. Electronic warfare, long viewed as a decisive counter, revealed its limitations. Jamming had forced the drone into inertial navigation and degraded accuracy, but it did not stop the mission. The system succeeded technically while failing operationally. By creating pressure to force emissions, they exposed their own predictability. The Russians had invested heavily in denying guidance, but not enough in denying opportunity. The drone only needed one clear moment near the end of its flight. Everything before that was expendable. That asymmetry favored the attacker, not the defender. Air superiority offered no protection in this equation. The MiG had dominated its patrol sector for weeks, intercepting slow reconnaissance drones and directing surface-to-air fire with confidence. In the air, it was lethal. On the ground, it was inert. Once parked, its speed, maneuverability, and sensors meant nothing. It became a static object with known coordinates. The strike reinforced a reality that modern air forces are still grappling with. Control of the sky does not guarantee safety on the ground, especially when the threat does not need to contest airspace to be effective. The immediate operational response reflected this shock. Patrol patterns over the Black Sea shifted within hours. Sortie rates dropped as commanders reassessed risk, dispersing remaining aircraft to secondary fields, rather than concentrating them at familiar bases. Jets that had previously rotated through predictable schedules were now moved irregularly, increasing logistical strain and reducing efficiency. The goal was not to regain dominance, but to reduce vulnerability. Every parked aircraft now carried an implicit question. How long had it been targeted already? Air defense priorities changed just as quickly. Systems once optimized to protect runways and approach corridors were repositioned to cover parking areas, shelters, and maintenance zones. Resources were diverted toward guarding assets that were no longer moving. This redistribution did nothing to change the outcome at Kachicha. It only acknowledged that the battlefield had shifted. Defenses were reacting to a lesson already delivered, not preventing it. The material cost of the loss was easily calculated. A single fighter airframe, its onboard systems, fuel, and stored munitions destroyed in seconds. But the deeper cost was harder to quantify. Confidence had been damaged. The Russians had believed they understood the engagement cycle. Detect the launch, reconstruct the vector, hunt the operators, and the drone threat collapses. That sequence had been reliable until it was not. At Kachcha, every step of that cycle had been executed, and it still failed. The most troubling realization was how little margin there had been for correction. Once the drone was launched, the window for intervention closed rapidly, killing the relay, destroying the presumed operators, and saturating the area with fire had all come too late. The decisive moment had occurred earlier, when the final heading correction was uploaded. From that point on, the outcome was locked in. The defenders were acting in real time against a decision that had already been made. By the time dawn reached Crimea, the revetment at Kachcha was still smoking. The concrete retained heat where metal had burned away, and the outline of the aircraft was visible only as a darker stain against scorched ground. A fighter that had spent weeks hunting drones had been erased without ever leaving the ground. Its pilot would wake to an absence rather than an alert, confronted with the knowledge that the threat he had pursued so confidently had found him first. Far from the airfield, the operators who enabled the strike were already gone. They moved through terrain that would soon be searched again, but for signatures that no longer existed. The sky over the Black Sea remained empty, calm, and deceptively quiet. Nothing in that stillness hinted at the planning, patience, and acceptance of risk that had turned a sleeping aircraft into a target hours before its pilot closed his eyes. At 0600 hours on a frozen morning in eastern Ukraine, 3 distinct shapes lifted off from a concealed position, their engines humming a low-frequency note that would soon be lost in the vastness of the steppe. 1,400 kilometers to the southeast, in the heart of Grozny, the morning sun was just beginning to hit the glass facade of a gleaming 28-story tower where the Chechen Security Council was preparing to start its workday. The administrative staff, making their morning coffee and checking emails, had absolutely no idea that a timer had just been started on their lives. They were completely unaware that 3 specific sets of coordinates had been programmed into a guidance computer 1,400 kilometers away. And in exactly 8 hours, Ukrainian engineering would punch right through their reinforced windows. The distance between the launch site and the target was not just physical. It was a journey through one of the densest air defense networks on the planet, a gauntlet that no commercial drone should theoretically be able to survive. As the 3 Ludi drones began their slow, calculated climb toward cruise altitude, the Ukrainian strategy for piercing that air defense network began to unfold 40 kilometers to the north. At 0603 hours, 43 UJ-22 drones lifted off from dispersed sites across the Kharkiv Oblast, creating a radar signature designed to scream for attention. These were not the silent assassins. These were the loud distractions. Within seconds, the first tracks appeared on Russian long-range surveillance radars along the northern Luhansk axis. To a radar operator staring at a monochrome scope, a drone does not look like a plastic toy. It looks like an incoming threat vector. First, 8 contacts filled the screen, then 15, then 23. The psychological pressure in a Russian command vehicle spikes exponentially with every new contact, forcing battery commanders to make split-second decisions that cost millions of dollars. Russian battery commanders requested immediate engagement authorization, while their radar operators worked frantically to separate genuine threats from atmospheric clutter and migrating birds. The first salvo came at 0607 hours, when a Buk M3 battery positioned northeast of Svatov roared to life. 4 9 M317M missiles streaked into the gray sky, trailing white smoke as they accelerated to Mach 4. This is the brutal economics of modern asymmetric warfare laid bare. $4.4 million worth of precision interceptors were now chasing $48,000 worth of foam and carbon fiber. The physics of the engagement were merciless. The missiles covered the distance in seconds, their semi-active radar seekers guiding them to the slow-moving drones with mathematical inevitability. 4 hits registered on the thermal sensors. 4 UJ-22s disintegrated into clouds of debris, scattering uselessly across the frozen fields. But the swarm kept coming, indifferent to the losses. A Panzer S-1 system joined the engagement at 0609 hours, its twin 30mm cannons splitting tracers into the sky in a desperate attempt to create a wall of lead. When the drones climbed above the effective gun range, the Panzer operators were forced to switch to their expensive missiles. 2 more UJ-22s tumbled out of the sky, followed by 3 more. The Russian operators were cycling through targets methodically, relying on their training, but they were expending interceptors at a rate their logistics chain could not possibly sustain. Each Buk missile cost $1.1 million. Each Panzer missile costs $60,000. The drones they were shooting at cost roughly $12,000 each. It was a financial hemorrhage disguised as a tactical victory, and every missile fired was one less missile available for what was coming behind the swarm. By 0612 hours, the Buk battery had exhausted its immediate ready-to-fire magazine. 16 missiles were gone, and 12 drones had been destroyed. The reload process began immediately, a cumbersome dance of heavy machinery that is the Achilles heel of sustained air defense operations. A transporter loader vehicle had to align precisely with the launcher, hydraulics whining as fresh missile containers were transferred to empty tubes. This process takes 4 minutes minimum under ideal conditions, and in combat, conditions are never ideal. For those critical 4 minutes, that specific battery contributed absolutely nothing to the air defense picture. It was effectively a multi-million-dollar paperweight sitting in the mud, its crew rushing to rearm while the sky above them remained contested. Panzer crew fared only marginally better, down to 3 remaining missiles and rotating their turret frantically to cover the gaps left by the reloading Buk. Tor missile batteries located further east had joined the engagement, their vertical launch systems cycling through targets, but they were firing at their maximum kinematic range where the probability of intercept drops significantly. At 0614 hours, with 19 UJ-22s still airborne and Russian batteries either reloading or fully depleted, the radar scope began to clear. Russian operators watched the surviving decoy drones scatter, some turning back, others continuing east towards targets that no longer possessed any strategic value. The immediate crisis appeared to be passing. Crews relaxed their posture, attention shifting to ammunition resupply and damage assessment, convinced they had repelled the main attack. 140 kilometers to the south, in a river valley creating a natural radar shadow between 2 Panzer coverage zones, the 3 Ludi drones crossed the front line at 400 feet. The timing was surgical. Ukrainian mission planners had calculated the Russian reload cycles and sector coverage with the same obsessive care they had used to calculate the strike road. The diversionary swarm was not just a distraction. It was a synchronized mechanism designed to create exactly this temporal window. Batteries depleted, operators fatigued, and attention fixed on the wrong axis. No alarms sounded, no missiles launched. The operators who might have detected the Ludus were busy watching their ammunition counters climb back toward full, not scanning the empty sectors to the south. By 0615 hours, the Ludus had climbed to 2,500 feet and turned southeast, invisible to the chaos behind them. At 0630 hours, the 3 Lutis settled into their cruise configuration over the empty steppe east of Luhansk. Their 4-stroke gasoline engines pushed them southeast at a steady 180 kilometers per hour, a pace that they would sustain for 8 hours straight. Unlike the disposable UJ-22s, the AN-196 Ludi is purpose-built for deep strike operations. The airframe is a low-wing monoplane with a 6.7-meter wingspan, roughly the length of a large sedan, and a 4.4-meter fuselage constructed of fiberglass composite over an aluminum skeleton. This material choice is deliberate. Fiberglass is transparent to radar waves, meaning the airframe itself generates almost no return signal. The pusher-propeller configuration places the engine behind the wing, driving a 3-blade prop, which further reduces the acoustic and thermal signature directed toward the ground. This engine arrangement is not an aesthetic choice. It is functional engineering designed to defeat heat-seeking sensors. By mounting the engine at the rear, the hot exhaust is pointed backward and upward, away from thermal sensors located on the ground. Furthermore, this positions the only major radar reflector, the metal engine block, behind the composite fuselage, where ground-based radars see the smallest possible cross-section. The nose of the drone contains 75 kilograms of high explosive encased in a fragmenting steel jacket. There is no expensive guidance seeker, no complex terminal sensor, just a simple contact fuse backed up by a radar altimeter fuse. The design philosophy is brutal minimalism. Simple systems work, complex systems fail. The drone is essentially a flying bomb that relies on obscurity rather than speed to survive. The center fuselage houses the fuel tank, mission computer, and navigation systems. 80 liters of standard automotive gasoline, the same fuel you would put in a civilian car, sits in a flexible bladder tank that moves with the airframe to prevent sloshing. The 6.7-meter wingspan provides a high lift-to-drag ratio at cruise speeds, allowing the airframe to essentially glide through the air with minimal engine power. The engine runs at partial throttle, lean and cool, maximizing fuel economy to achieve a terrifying range. The result is 10 to 12 hours of endurance, giving the Ludi a range of roughly 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers depending on wind conditions and altitude profiles. But the physical range is far from the most impressive part of this machine. The mission computer is where the Ludi separates itself from regular commercial drones. It runs the Skynote S flight control system, a specialized piece of hardware developed by Ukrainian defense partners. The processor sits in a hardened enclosure the size of a smartphone that integrates three critical functions: autopilot, mission execution, and GPS-denied navigation. Inside the enclosure sits the navigation brain, an inertial measurement unit. Think of this as a military-grade version of the motion sensors in your smartphone. Accelerometers that detect changes in speed and direction, and gyroscopes that track rotation. The difference lies in the precision. Where a commercial phone might drift hundreds of meters in an hour without satellite correction, these military units drift maybe a few dozen meters. It is not perfect, but it is good enough for autonomous flight in a jamming environment. The technique that makes this deep penetration possible is called dead reckoning, the same method sailors have used for centuries to cross oceans. The computer knows where it started. It measures exactly how it has moved. It calculates where it must be. The problem is that error accumulates over time. Every tiny measurement inaccuracy compounds, growing larger with every kilometer traveled. After 8 hours of flight, position uncertainty could reach 800 meters to 2.4 kilometers. For a strike against a single building, that is the difference between mission success and hitting the wrong city block. The Ludi's solution is a downward-facing camera capturing the terrain at 10 to 15 frames per second. The processor compares what it sees: road intersections, river bends, field patterns, against a library of satellite imagery loaded before launch. Each successful match generates a position fix that resets the accumulated drift to zero. In Dnipro, inside a nondescript room filled with server racks and cooling fans, operators watched three monochrome icons crawl excruciatingly slowly across a high-resolution digital map. There was no live video feed, no cinematic view of the terrain rushing by, and no joystick control. A continuous video transmission would require high-bandwidth output that acts like a beacon for Russian signals intelligence, effectively painting a giant target on the drone for electronic warfare units to triangulate. Every 15 minutes, each Ludi drone transmitted a highly compressed data burst containing its coordinates, altitude, heading, engine temperature, fuel remaining, and system status. The transmission lasted exactly 0.3 seconds, a pulse so brief it barely registered on enemy monitoring equipment as background static before vanishing. Between these pulses, the drones were effectively ghosts, executing their pre-programmed mission autonomously while the human operators sat on their hands, unable to intervene. If something went wrong between check-ins, an engine failure, a bird strike, or an interception, they would only learn about it 15 minutes later, or more likely from Russian Telegram channels posting photos of the wreckage. At 0645 hours, Ludi 1 reported a slight deviation of 340 meters north of its intended track during its scheduled burst. The navigation system had already detected the error and corrected it autonomously, adjusting the heading 2 degrees south to intercept the original flight path. The operators noted the correction and did absolutely nothing. This was the discipline of deep strike warfare. The system was working exactly as designed, and human interference would only introduce latency and risk. But the easy part of the mission was now over. Ahead of the drones lay 400 kilometers of the empty steppe, a geographical feature that presented a unique technological nightmare. For the terrain-matching camera system to work, it needs contrast: landmarks, roads, buildings, or riverbanks. The steppe offered none of these. It was an ocean of grass extending to every horizon, devoid of the high-contrast features the navigation algorithms needed to reset the inertial drift. The emptiness that hid the drones from Russian surface-to-air missile batteries also made them vulnerable in ways the operators in Dnipro could not see yet. Russia does not waste expensive missiles defending empty territory. Instead, it creates vast zones of radar silence where threats are assumed to be non-existent. At 0930 hours, Ludi 2 crossed into the Republic of Kalmykia at 2,800 feet. Below the drone, there was nothing but desolation. 270,000 people scattered across an area the size of Scotland. The drone's downward-facing camera captured frame after frame of brown grass, occasional dirt roads that faded into nothing, and scattered livestock ponds that reflected the morning sky. The route through Kalmykia was not chosen at random. It was the result of weeks of analysis by Ukrainian planners who tracked Russian air defense positions using satellite imagery, signals intelligence intercepts, and partisan reports. Russia possesses roughly 50 to 60 active air defense regiments in total, a formidable number on paper, but woefully insufficient to cover the largest country on Earth. Strategic systems like the S-400 are concentrated in dense rings around Moscow and critical infrastructure. Crimea gets dense, overlapping coverage due to its strategic value. The front line gets tactical systems like the Tor and Buk. But Kalmykia? It has no military bases of significance, no strategic heavy industry, and nothing to defend. A drone flying at 3,000 feet might trigger one early warning radar sweep per hour from a distant installation, but the weak return signal would almost certainly be classified by the automated filters as a large bird or atmospheric anomaly and ignored. But the strategic emptiness that made the route safe from missiles made it dangerous in another way. When Russia cannot cover a region with missiles, it covers it with fighter aircraft. 300 kilometers to the west at Privolzhsky Air Base, two Sukhoi Su-35 Flanker E fighters had scrambled at 0645 hours, exactly 38 minutes after the decoy swarm first appeared on Russian radar screens. The diversionary attack in the north had done its job by depleting the missile batteries, but it had also achieved a secondary effect. It announced to the entire Russian southern military district that Ukraine was launching a major drone operation. Fighter Command responded with the standard doctrine used whenever unidentified swarms appear: sweep the corridors and find what is hiding behind the noise. The Su-35 is Russia's answer to drone hunting over vast territories, a twin-engine air superiority fighter equipped with the Irbis-E passive phased array radar. This radar system is a beast of electromagnetic power, capable of detecting a 3 square meter target at 400 kilometers or a 0.01 square meter target at roughly 90 kilometers under perfect conditions. The Ludy's composite airframe, however, presented a target profile that confused these standard metrics. Constructed of fiberglass and foam with a small metal engine block, its radar cross-section registered somewhere between a large Hawk and a small ultralight aircraft. Detectability depended entirely on the geometry of the encounter, the altitude difference, and a significant amount of luck. The fighters flew a standard search pattern, executing north-south legs at 15,000 feet. Their radars swept the terrain below, covering ground in minutes that would take surface-to-air missile batteries days to monitor. Their patrol box sat directly across the Kalmykia corridor, not because they had specific intelligence that the Ludus were there, but because Russian air defense doctrine dictated that they patrol that specific choke point whenever drone activity spiked in the region. At 0947 hours, Ludy 1's navigation system faced its hardest mathematical test yet. The visual matching algorithm had absolutely nothing to work with. The camera was feeding the processor images of featureless grassland, livestock ponds that had dried up since the reference satellite photos were taken months ago, and unpaved roads that had been erased by recent weather. For 11 agonizing minutes, the camera captured nothing that the processor could confidently match against its onboard database. Inside the hardened computer enclosure, the Kalman filter, the algorithm responsible for estimating the drone's position, worked frantically to manage the rising uncertainty. It predicted the current position based on the last known fix plus the measured motion from the accelerometers, updating 10 times per second. But without visual corrections to anchor the data, the error accumulated exponentially. First, the drift was 35 meters, then 70 meters, then 120 meters. The filter knew its confidence was degrading. It adjusted its uncertainty estimates accordingly, widening the search parameters and waiting desperately for a recognizable landmark to reset the drift. If the drone did not find a match soon, the accumulated error would become so large that even if it eventually found a landmark, it might be too far off course to match it against the correct sector of the map. At 0952 hours, the camera finally captured a concrete highway interchange, the first hard, recognizable feature in 20 minutes of flight. The processor matched it instantly. Confidence spiked to 94%. The position uncertainty collapsed in a millisecond from 140 meters down to 12 meters. The drone adjusted its heading by 1.3 degrees and continued southeast, the crisis averted by a matter of minutes. But 200 kilometers to the west, the Su-35s were turning east, and their massive radars were about to paint something that did not look like a bird. At 10:15 hours, the lead Su-35's radar got a momentary hit. The signal was faint, a blip that appeared on the scope and then disappeared after 1.2 seconds as the radar beam swept past without dwelling. The drone had no electronic countermeasures, no chaff, no flares, and no way to fight back against a $50 million fighter jet. Its only defense was being small, slow, and flying low. 60 kilometers to the west, the Su-35 flight lead reviewed his radar picture. The sweep had returned 2 anomalous contacts, faint, slow-moving, and at an altitude where birds did not usually fly in strict formation. It was probably nothing. Weather artifacts and thermal pockets rising off the warming steppe often created false returns that looked exactly like this. However, military doctrine is rigid. It required the investigation of any contact that could not be immediately classified as biological or atmospheric. The fighters banked hard and turned east. In Dnipro, the operators were completely blind to the drama unfolding above their assets. The Lutis continued to transmit their position updates only every 15 minutes, compressed bursts too brief to carry any warning of the approaching threat. Between check-ins, the drones flew blind, and the operators watched icons crawl across a map, trusting the navigation systems to deliver them to Grozny. At 10:23 hours, the Su-35s descended to 8,000 feet, dropping below the altitude where their look-down/shoot-down radar performed best, but close enough to get visual confirmation on the anomalies. The flight lead's electro-optical targeting pod scanned the suspected coordinates, searching for the telltale shape of a drone against the brown earth. The targeting pod magnified the ground, showing grass, shadows, and a dirt road cutting through the steppe. Nothing. The Lutis had dropped to 400 feet exactly 3 minutes earlier, not because they knew the fighters were coming, but because the navigation system was struggling again with the featureless terrain. Lower altitude meant higher resolution for the camera and more ground detail for the visual matcher. This inadvertent altitude change had pushed them below the Su-35's radar horizon at precisely the right moment, hiding them in the ground clutter. The flight lead marked the contacts as probable false returns caused by ground reflections, Schossmannans, and turned northeast toward the next search sector. Drones had survived by sheer coincidence, but the near miss forced a decision back in Ukraine that would nearly end the mission. At 10:31 hours, Ukrainian mission planners monitoring the drones realized the altitude and route they were on would introduce too much error to guarantee a hit on a specific window in a specific building. They could not communicate with the Lutis directly to fly them like video game characters. Any continuous transmission would compromise the mission. However, they could update the backup waypoints stored in the drone's computers during the next scheduled handshake. At 13:05 hours, the Lutis crossed into Chechen airspace. Ludi 1 and 2 held their course, their inertial systems drifting but correcting with visual matches. Ludi 3 did not. The jamming had been degrading its navigation solution for 11 minutes when the visual system made a catastrophic error. A misidentified riverbend sealed its fate. The algorithm matched the current terrain against the wrong location in the reference database, calculating a position fix that was 400 meters off true. The Kalman filter evaluated the match. Confidence looked reasonable. Without GPS to verify the location, and with the inertial measurement unit drift accumulating, the filter accepted the bad data as truth. The drone adjusted its heading to correct for a drift that did not exist. The correction took it further off course, then further still. By the time subsequent visual matches might have revealed the error, Ludi 3 had deviated too far to recover. It flew into a hillside at 180 kilometers per hour. In Dnipro, the icon simply vanished from the screen. No final transmission, no explanation. One moment it was there, then gone. The operators stared at the screen, then at each other. Both remaining drones were now drifting too, their guidance systems fighting a losing battle against the electronic noise. But Ludi 2 was drifting towards something the operators could not see and would not understand until the moment of impact. At 13:45 hours, the drones entered their terminal approach phase. The Skynode computers transitioned from cruise navigation to attack profile. Altitude dropped further, the lower profile reducing exposure time to any point defense systems protecting the city. Speed increased as they burned the remaining fuel to maximize kinetic energy. At 13:47 hours, Ludi 1 struck the 28th floor of the Grozny City Business Center's eastern tower. The 75-kilogram warhead detonated instantly on contact, blowing out the facade across 5 floors. Glass and debris rained down onto Kadyrov Avenue, sending pedestrians scrambling for cover. But the building had never been the primary target. It was collateral damage caused by the navigation drift. Ludi 2 impacted 8 seconds later, 3 floors below, delivering its payload directly into the offices of the Chechen Security Council. The explosion punched through the exterior wall, fragmented across the interior, and shredded the cubicles.